Chapter 20 of Sally on the Rocks by Winifred Boggs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20. Oh, Mr Bingley, what a mercy you're safe. As they came in sight of the Hopkins house, Mr Bingley was disagreeably conscious of one or two factors which, small things in themselves, made a well-nigh unbearable total. To begin with, in the room he knew for Miss Maggie's was the vague outline of a dressing-gowned figure hiding behind the curtains, but only too plainly visible was a long, thin, pointed nose pressed against the pane. Add to this the fact that the milkman was even then entering the gate, and that slinking shamefacedly behind him was a dissipated cat, and you get the sum total. As they got exactly opposite the house, Miss Maggie, wrapping herself chastely in the curtains, waved gaily. Sally waved back, laughing. "Oh, don't do that," commanded Mr Bingley sharply. "She's an awful woman, an awful woman." "Oh, she's quite a friend of mine," returned Sally, "and not so bad when you really come to know her. I'm afraid she will talk about this, though." Even then, Mr Bingley did not say anything a lay reader may not, but he let his thoughts run a little wild. He wondered why it should be necessary that they should encounter the whole working population of Litte Crampton setting forth to its labours, and such an interested population. They'd touch their caps, of course, but they looked. Well, those sort of people had such minds. Finally, they met Mr Lovelady, who looked with most unclerical anger at Mr Bingley and caught Sally's hand. "My darling child, where have you been? What has happened?" He ignored her escort. Sally explained, and then she nodded a casual dismissal to Mr Bingley and slipped her hand through her guardian's arm. "Oh, lovey, never get lost with Bingley people. It's dull. I wish... or calculate on the moon rising." "I wish you hadn't got lost with that fellow," exclaimed Mr Lovelady. "There may be some foolish gossip now." "There may," agreed Sally indifferently. Later in the day she ran into Mrs Dalton, and that lady sighed enviously. "Oh dear, I could never have thought of anything so clever. Besides, I couldn't have walked far enough to lose him. How did things go off?" "Things didn't go off," said Sally ruefully, albeit with a twinkle. "Almost, but not quite. It's weary work, though I cannot deny I feel the thrill of the chase at times. It's fun fishing, and awfully exciting when at last you strike the right bait, but a bore when he gobbles it up, and just as you're playing him skilfully, the line breaks and he's secure in his funk hole again." Mrs Dalton cheered up. "Oh, then in spite of all the opportunities—" "I wasn't quick enough in saying snip to his snap. You know how it used to be when you were a child and they gave you a pill to swallow. The pill seemed so big and beastly and impossible, your throat simply closed up and would not have it. Well, my throat closed up when it came to the psychological moment. Of course, I shall not bungle the opportunity another time." "If it comes—" Sally accepted the correction, laughing. "One must make one's opportunities sometimes. He was rather Bingley-ish, which was bad, but I was really Sally-ish, which was far worse. A fatal combination at any rate." "Oh, do you know there's a serious run on the bank?" asked Mrs Dalton, beginning to laugh violently. "And owing to the recent enlistments, Mr Bingley has to face it all by himself. Miss Maggie has just gone to save her money in time. Oh, how pleased he'll be. He does so love being the centre of the stage. Oh, and he's got that all right now. Nobody's even mentioned the war today." For once, however, Mr Bingley did not care for the blaze of publicity. The fierce white light could be positively too glaring. The boy, however, enjoyed himself hugely. When he saw the steady onrush of customers, a thrilling solution occurred to him. Mr Bingley had been tampering with the till, and people had found out. Contrary to the usual custom, he opened both the doors. "What are you doing?" asked the bank manager angrily. "Oh, it looks like a run, sir," said the boy respectfully. "I thought there'd be too much of a crush, sir, for the one side of the door." He wondered if Mr Bingley would get away to America. "Shut the door at once," commanded Mr Bingley, turning yellow. "Both sides, sir, to keep them out altogether, sir?" "No, you fool," barked the bank manager. "As usual, of course." "Ratty," thought the boy, and had no longer any doubt of his manager's guilt. He supposed that when the cash fell short, Mr Bingley would make a bolt to the back and try to get to the station en route for America. He had a delightful vision of the fat old buster sprinting for all he was worth stationwards, pursued by the portly police of Litte Crampton. He feared that the police were too Cramptonian to overtake a gentleman with an income. On the other hand, Mr Peyton and fat Mr Bolivar were special constables, and if Mr Bolivar only had the presence of mind to stand in the narrow entry leading to the station, it would be all up with Mr Bingley. The boy had not decided what part he would take himself in the hue and cry. Suppose Mr Bingley paid to be let off, or not to be taken up — he had an idea justice for the rich was tempered with mercy — and came back to the bank. He had too good a post to lose, and a good enough master. He decided to lie low till he saw how things went. He had heard of Mr Bingley being lost all night with Parson's Sally, but he thought nothing of that. It was the scandal of embezzlement he had in his mind's eye. "They're all coming, sir," he announced about 11 o'clock, trying to make his voice sound calm. Mr Bingley did not vulgarly say, "Let 'em all come," neither did he think it. Sally comfortably in bed, he bearing the brunt. That was life. He stood very erectly behind the counter, keeping a stiff upper lip. He felt like Daniel in the lion's den, but trusted rather to his own abilities to bring him safely through than to a miracle. A crowd of his acquaintances came hurrying in. Then Mr Bolivar rolled up, blocking the way. "Oh, don't stand there, Bolivar, please," commanded Mr Bingley sharply. "Nobody can pass." The fat fool. Nobody mentioned the moors. They talked of everything save Mr Bingley's adventure, but how they looked. When the bank was absolutely crowded, Miss Maggie entered, having waited her moment. Interest quickened, and all made room for her. People who had been served examined their money again, or could not get the clasp of their purse fastened, or find this or that. Mr Peyton stood in a corner, folding and unfolding a cheque he had not yet presented. He had known Miss Maggie would come. She knew she had the ball at her feet, or rather Mr Bingley. People would leave him to her gladly. She came to the counter. "Oh, Mr Bingley, what a mercy you're safe," she exclaimed thankfully. "You little guess what I suffered on your account." "Oh, very good of you," said Mr Bingley stonily, "but quite unnecessary. I fancy I'm not the first little Cramptonian to be lost on the moors. Many have done that, I believe." "Oh, yes, Mr Bingley, but they did it differently. Your circumstances were quite unique. I cannot tell you how upset I was." "I trust you had a little sympathy to spare for Miss Lunton," said Mr Bingley suavely. "I am so afraid she may catch a chill." "Oh, Sally never catches chills, and she can look after herself. I dare say she's been lost before." "Oh, yes, so she told me." "Oh, with whom?" asked Miss Maggie, pouncing. "Oh, her friend was another girl. They were on a tour." "Another girl? Oh, how unlike Sally. In Italy, I suppose. She's so very fond of Italy. What a varied career the dear girl has had, has she not?" Mr Bingley reached out his hand for her cheque. "And how will you take it?" Miss Maggie tightened her grasp on the cheque. "Oh, I haven't signed it. How silly. I must see to it when the pen and ink are vacant." She knew they were not going to be vacant just yet. People's eyes were anywhere but on the two conversing, but their ears had a sort of tense look, and one could certainly have heard a pin drop. "What was the name of the other man she got lost with in Italy?" she asked. "I don't understand you," returned Mr. Bingley. "Her friend was a girl, of course. She did not mention her name. Haven't you done with the ink, Bolivar?" "I have not, Bingley," returned Mr. Bolivar firmly. "Oh, poor Sally must have been surprised to find herself lost on the moors she knows so well, and such a dark night, too." "Yes," agreed the tortured Mr. Bingley. "We hoped for the moon." She didn't let him finish. "Oh, Mr. Bingley, what a romantic confession!" she cried archly. "To find our way back by." "Oh, what a waste of a moon! Oh, forgive me, but you know we women, especially we old maids, are so romantic. We always associate the moon with, well, you know." She looked down coyly, and somebody tittered and then tried to turn it into a cough. "Well, not being a single lady." "Oh, but you are a single man. At least we suppose so." There was another badly managed cough. "We wish to get back as soon as possible. It was very chilly and uncomfortable." "Oh, but what a lot you must have found to talk of in all that time. A whole night." "We lit a fire, and Miss Lunton went to sleep. I, of course, kept the fire up." "Oh, how romantic you must have felt, like a knight in armour, or a sentry, or one of those sort of things." "Not at all," he frowned. "I was very hungry and chilled to the bone."
"Still, it was exactly like the hero and heroine in a novel, where they marry and live happy ever afterwards. You can't think how it moves me to think of you sitting there all night, just like a guardian angel. I wonder if the other one she got lost with did. The girl, I mean. Oh, Mr. Bingley, forgive me. I know you'll understand, but didn't it make you feel, well, just a little bit risqué?"
"It did not," barked Mr. Bingley, flushing darkly. "Oh, dash the woman!"
"Oh, perhaps I can have the ink at last," demanded Miss Maggie. "Thank you so much."
She took out her cheque slowly.
"You know, I happened to see you pass. Such a coincidence. And of course I expected to see you return. And when you didn't, oh, Mr. Bingley."
"The blotting paper is to your right, Miss Maggie."
"Oh, thank you. Oh, could I have a cleaner piece? Oh, you little know what a night I spent, wondering and wondering, so very worrying. If only I'd known what to do for the best. You see, the farm boy knows the moors well, and I thought of sending him with a lantern, and then again I didn't quite like to. People don't always want to be found."
"It would have been a great help if you had sent the boy."
"I did so want to act for the best, as you would wish, you and dear Sally."
"A boy with a lantern would have been a godsend. I'm afraid Miss Lunton may have caught cold. I know I have. What you could have saved us!"
"Oh, how very unfortunate. But as an elderly spinster one does so hate to meddle. But next time. I happened to be looking out of my window early, and such a coincidence. There was the milk coming, and poor Tom slinking home. Oh, such a dissipated cat. And you and dear Sally. Poor girl, her hair was half down, and her hat anyhow, in the road too. Oh, is that the clean blotting paper? Thank you so much. I'll trouble you, Mr. Bolivar."
She took her money and left with a beaming smile. Others followed her. She was the heroine of the hour, and overwhelmed with tea invitations. She accepted 1 for 4 and 1 for 5. she would do full justice to both. Mr. Peyton rushed to the club. Mr. Bolivar bounded after him. Gradually the crowd thinned, and the boy realised that nothing had happened, and nothing was going to happen. Probably Mr. Bingley had got alarmed and replaced the money. To Mr. Bingley himself it did not seem as if nothing had happened. He went home a nervous wreck. For some days he did without exercise, as he did not wish to meet anyone, but he ate just the same meals. The results were unfortunate. He felt he had Sally to blame for a severe attack of indigestion. He was glad to remember there was a war going on. Surely one of the generals would do something to get talked about, advance or retreat, and Mr. Bingley's unhappy adventure would pass as 9 days' wonders always do. His mother's book was less helpful than usual. "Don't marry the woman you intrigue with. Intrigue if you must, and then don't marry her." Well, he hadn't intrigued, and he was not going to. Bingleys didn't. "Don't marry a woman who runs after you before. She will either run after somebody else once she's got you, or from you." Had Sally run after him? On the contrary, had she not been almost rude? The determined woman dares all. Was Sally determined? Or was the book warning him against Mrs. Dalton? This traitor citadel that longed to surrender unconditionally. That was why he fought so hard, refused to be thrust into marriage to stop idle tongues. He wanted to marry Sally for himself, even though he could not feel as certain as he would like about the absolute correctness of the future bank manager. But he also wanted to marry her because he knew it to be the absolutely right, sensible and profitable thing, and because his genius mother would have approved. He had decided he might fall in love enough to be pleasant, but not enough to be uncomfortable, and that he would fall out the moment it seemed expedient to do so. Instead, he found things much more uncomfortable than pleasant, and also that, once in, one could not climb out all at once. Some driving force was literally pushing him into Sally's arms. Night after night he dreamed of her, the Sally of the rosy firelight, never of the grey dawn. In his dreams he loved more than was reasonable or quite seemly in one of his age and position, and was ever the Prince Charming, watching over the slumbers of the sleeping beauty, and waiting breathlessly, thrillingly, for the magic moment when he should wake her with a kiss. He invariably awoke just before the vision materialized, and thought a little peevishly that he had not much luck in his dreams. He always awoke just a second too soon. Once out of his dream, or lying awake in the early morning, he became more or less sensible again. And if it was a losing battle he fought, and in his heart of hearts he knew it, he still fought on. He must have Sally. He would have Sally, cried the old Adam, to be amended by the wiser self, who said that certainly he should have Sally, not because others thought he ought to, but because he wished it, and it was right that he should. He refused to be rushed or do anything in a hurry, and yet a burning impatience filled him. He sought safety in flight, but he could not fly from that surging, insistent thing, striving for life and utterance within him. The coils were closing round Mr. Alfred Bingley. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Sally on the Rocks by Winifred Boggs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21. I think he's set on not getting better. Dying, belike, Miss Sally. Mr. Lovelady was preaching, and his congregation was for the most part doing everything but listen. Church was the sort of place in which you thought things well out. He preached from the text, "They that go down to the sea in ships and have their business in deep waters," and pointed out what a new and terrible significance these words had come to mean. It was a moving little sermon, almost eloquent. It moved Mr Bingley, for before he sat down to his luxurious repast, he posted a cheque for £5 to a sailors' orphanage. He had a heart for the child victims of the war. He had not spoken to Sally since the Moor adventure, and it was a little difficult to greet her as if nothing had happened, with so many looking on, but he managed it well enough. Quite a good sermon, he was pleased to say.
"Oh, I like the one about Lot's wife best," said Miss Maggie, coming up to them. "So original. One can hear it several times and still find it that. I thought it was the turn for it today. So unusual for a man to own his wife is bound to look back."
Mr Bingley shook Miss Maggie from him, so to speak, and fled. He had unfortunately to shake Sally from him also, for Miss Maggie had her in her clutches.
"Oh, how charming you look," gushed the spinster. "So different from the other morning. How bored you must have got with his conversation."
"Oh, Mr Bingley can be quite amusing."
"Really? And was the other one you got lost with amusing? Oh, how bilious he looked. I always think that the wife suffers most from her husband's indigestion, don't you?"
"I don't happen to have a husband."
"Oh, my dear, don't give in so soon. A man like that, too, always having dead relations. He must have been born under a lucky star, as the saying is. With us, just as you think it's about time you got an invitation to a funeral, you get one to a wedding, which simply means more of them."
Miss Lydia came listlessly up to them.
"If the worst comes to the worst, there's Canada, where husbands grow on every bush, they say. Oh, that's the place for women getting on."
Lydia wondered why it had not occurred to her to go to Canada some years back. Why must she think of everything too late, be forever viewing the might-have-beens? "Canada?" gasped Sally. "I had a friend who married a rancher, and I happen to know what it means. Good Lord, that's the last thing I would do."
"It would be your own home and your own husband," said Miss Lydia. "And think what it would mean to him. You'd be building the empire through your work and children."
"Oh, yes, and working like a slave. Give me civilization every time."
"Oh, and a good income," giggled Miss Maggie, "and someone to pay the piper. Well, after a night on the moors—"
"You can get lost with anybody."
"Oh, so it seems," agreed the spinster. "So it seems."
Mr Lovelady came out of church, and Sally went off with him. He was looking very tired. She slipped her arm through his and began in her energetic fashion to post up the hill. "Oh, my dear," said Mr Lovelady a little breathlessly, "there's no great hurry." "Oh, sorry, dear. Why, it seems only the other day you used to race me up this hill and win." "Oh, rather a long day, I think." He sighed. He knew he would never race up a hill again. Each time he felt walking up it more. "My dearest, I'm so thankful that absurd gossip has died down about you and Bingley, and that you're not encouraging his attentions any more. He's not worthy of my Sally." She squeezed his arm. "Oh, blind lovey. Ducky, darling, do you think I could have a pair of shot silk stockings and those new high boots? Something chaste and striking. They strike you first, and you think how chaste afterwards. Oh, if you really can afford them." He afforded them, though they seemed to him very small and trifling details to cost so much. "Oh, it'll be awkward if you marry a poor man," he said thoughtfully. Sally's mouth closed tightly. She had no intention of doing anything of the sort. £3,000 per annum, with more to come, was not poverty. "You're not out for romance at 31. It's business," she thought. She made an impatient sound. That wretched man again! Why should his eyes haunt her so? What was it they asked of her all the time? She went off to the moors to see. On the way she ran into Miss Maggie, who had a sheaf of letters for the post, and thrust them hastily into the slit as Sally appeared.
"Oh, what a coincidence meeting you again," she said. "We always seem to be coming across each other, don't we? You off to the moors, and I posting letters."
She seemed very amused. Ever since she had chanced upon her clue, she had been extremely busy running the scent to earth. She wrote to the managers of certain Italian hotels, explaining how she had lost sight of some very dear friends for years, but had last heard of them at such a place on such a date. Their name was Tompkins, a honeymoon couple, and their description so-and-so. She enclosed an international coupon and addressed envelope with each letter, and begged to be favoured with a reply. The replies were slow in coming, and some of them were disappointing. It was taking time, but on the whole she was satisfied. She considered she was getting enough evidence for a divorce case if necessary. She wanted it all in black and white. Poor Mrs. Randall, what a shock, but kinder that she should be told. In the meanwhile she was very friendly to Sally, and encouraged her in her pursuit of Mr. Bingley. That also fitted in with her plans. She liked to see her victims crashing down from a great height. "What a lot of letters you write, and such long ones," said Sally unsuspiciously. "It bores me."
"Oh, we poor spinsters have to do something," said Miss Maggie deprecatingly. "Even Lydia is knitting. She's knitting something for a soldier, poor fellow. One of those sorts of things one can't get in or out of. She says they're not fussy in the trenches and that it'll keep him warm. Oh, it'll certainly keep him busy. Talking about being busy, how Mrs. Dalton has launched out in clothes lately. Do you know, she has practically no money at all, but is putting it all into Mr. Bingley. It's to be hoped that he won't prove one of those bubble speculations that blow up when you least expect it. Oh, my dear, why don't you accept the poor man?"
Sally made the obvious answer. "Well, it's usual to wait to be asked."
"Oh, he's walking about like a cat on hot bricks. One knows what that means. He gave Nina a box of chocolates with a dove on the box the other day. So touching."
"Were they good chocolates?" asked Sally. "So often the picture is the best part."
"Oh, the very best. The dear child was dreadfully sick, twice. The devotion between them is really most touching. Such a pity you haven't something like that. A dear little brother, say."
Sally laughed.
"Oh, how gay you always are, whatever comes or goes. Such a light heart. After all, it is better for a woman to be too light than too heavy. Better for having a good time, I mean. Oh, how you must miss Paris and Italy and your naughty, naughty pictures. Well, if you're going on the moors, we may as well go as far as the house together. Won't you come in and have tea?"
"No, thank you." Miss Maggie gave her arm a playful pinch. "Oh, you do love the moors, don't you? So many attractions. Naughty girl." Then she went into the house, and had a long gossip with Mrs. Gillette's daughter, who acted as their maid of all work, and preferred Miss Maggie to the others. She was always ready to come into the kitchen for a talk, and made very little work in the house. Give her hot cakes for tea, and plenty of them, and Miss Maggie stood up for you through thick and thin. Meanwhile, Sally hurried on her errand, feeling very nervous and anxious about it, but hopeful of finding Robert Cantyre at home, as it was Sunday, and coming to some explanation. If there were any signs of insobriety, she would return at once and never seek him out again. It was horrible to think she should be haunted like this by a man who not only drank, but who had insulted her. As she passed Moor End Farm, Gillette came out of the door and ran after her. "Oh, Miss Sally, I'm rare glad you've come up," he exclaimed thankfully. "I didn't know what to do or nothing. Poor chap." Sally felt herself turn white and sick. She was too late. He had passed through the ever-open door this time. Now, too late, she realised what she'd seen in his eyes. He was asking her to help him, to save him, and she'd left him to his fate. Gillette caught her by the arm. "Oh, Miss Sally, you be took queer." "Oh, no, I'm all right now. You mean you mean White? He's dead?" Her stiff lips could hardly frame the words. "Oh, not dead yet, miss, but going that way. He won't help hisself." "Oh, how did it happen?" "I didn't notice naught at first. Then one day when he was working, he crumpled up like with pain. But he come the next day and said it was naught. But he was took worse, and yesterday we had to carry him to the hut, and there he lies, miss, not saying anything, but looking awful." "Poison?" she got out. "Oh, no, some of his innards gone wrong like. Maybe this here appendicitis, but he won't see no doctor." "He must." "Oh, you talk to him, Miss Sally. It's wonderful the power you have over him. You mind the last time you come up to talk to him about the drink? I thought he was set in it, that nothing would save him. But after you spoke to him, not a drop did he touch." Sally stood very still for a moment, her face whiter than ever. "Are you sure?" she got out at last. "Oh, I could take my oath upon it in a court of law. Oh, don't look so upset, missy. Maybe you can help him again and make him see the doctor and put some heart in him." "Oh, yes, he must see Dr. Hill." "Oh, you see, it's like this. I think he's set on not getting better. Dying, belike, Miss Sally." Sally ran to the hut. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Sally on the Rocks by Winifred Boggs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22. Will you stay with me to the end? She was almost as panic-stricken as when she had run from the cattle. On each occasion it seemed like running a race with death and losing. She looked in at the cracked window-pane, fearing she knew not what, perhaps a still form lying under a sheet and the last long silence. But it had not come to that yet. The door into the inner room was open, and a pale face lay on a pillow with closed eyes. Robert Cantyre certainly looked ill, but he did not seem to be in pain. He seemed to know by instinct that she had noiselessly entered the hut, for his eyes opened instantly. There was the same haunting appeal in them. "I never thought to see you again," he said weakly. Sally sat down on a chair by the bed and took his hand in both hers. "That was a very silly thing to think," she said reproachfully. His hand trembled. "I offended beyond forgiveness." "Oh, you did not offend at all," she retorted. "That was somebody else, somebody you've conquered and overthrown. Gillette told me. Oh, I think you're splendid. I wish I could be fine like that. I can only dimly guess what the struggle must have meant. And now, poor dear, you have the last heroic fight before you, to get well and strong." Robert's face had lightened at her first words, but now the light died out of it, and an intense weariness took its place. "I would not take the other way out now," he said, "but this makes everything so simple." "It'll be cowardice again, all the same," she scolded. "The line of least resistance, suicide to all intents and purposes. Of course you're ill, but think how strong you are. We're going to pull you through whether you like it or not, but don't throw all the work on us. Gillette is waiting outside, and I'm going to send him for Dr. Hill." Robert half raised himself. "I won't see him," he cried angrily. "Oh, yes, you will, and you'll like him too." She went outside and gave Gillette the message. "You don't allow a fellow body or soul of his own," burst out the patient when she returned. "It's been like that from the moment I saw you." "And it's going to go on like that, or till you're out of the wood," she returned. "And there's a sound mind in a sound body. Have you any idea what's wrong?" "It feels like an old bullet broken loose or something. The pain is very sudden, both going and coming, and it seems to move about.
When I got it 15 years ago, I was warned drink might set up mischief."
"You will tell Dr. Hill. You needn't tell him anything else. People do not guess the truth, but they do suspect you are not a real working man. You're free from pain now?"
"Yes, just numb after the last attack."
"Is it bad?"
He didn't answer for a moment, and then he said,
"It isn't pleasant."
It was indeed excruciating. He had never been ill in his life, and this, his first experience of weakness, seemed to him extreme. A young giant with the strength of an ox, now unable to raise his head. That could mean only one thing, death. The fainting weariness, too, that was its preliminary. He wished it were over. He felt he had only to let go to be done with life. Yet Sally's black eyes, so soft, so vital, seemed as if they sought to drag him back. Back to what? To horrible memories, outlawry, a shameful and intolerable existence. He wouldn't look in Sally's eyes any longer. To be quite on the safe side, he closed his own. At the same time, his grasp tightened on the girl's hand. "You are going to do your best?" she said insistently.
"Oh, that's not much use if one's hour has struck, Sally."
The name slipped out unconsciously. "You will stay with me to the end?" Sally turned white and sick, and was horribly afraid. Then she flicked his hand lightly and said, "End? What end? I never heard such rubbish. I'll go away and stay away if you're going to play the coward." She got up as if to go. "Now I name my price. I'll stay with you as much as you like, if you'll play the game like a soldier and fight and fight."
"Oh, very well," he grumbled crossly.
His hand felt for hers. She sat down again and took it in her own. "You must keep quiet and not talk any more till Dr. Hill comes." He seemed ready enough to obey. He sank into a doze of exhaustion, and Sally looked down, a little ache stealing into her heart. She didn't want Robert Cantyre to die. There would be another blank in her life if he died. She liked him very much. He was something that in a sort of way belonged to her. Just then she wanted him to live more than she wanted anything in the world, and would have purchased his life at any cost. Dr. Hill was puzzled with the case. He did not think the theory of the bullet breaking away likely, but he did not say it was impossible. There was undoubtedly severe inflammation. Sally took him into the other room, closing the door. "Will he live?"
"Oh, if we can get the inflammation down before it spreads or strikes deeper."
"And if not?"
"A bad case," he said briefly. "He must go to the hospital at once. There may have to be an operation."
Robert refused to be taken to the hospital. Once there, he would lie in a ward with others, see Sally on visiting days, and then in the midst of a crowd. When he was discharged cured, she'd take no further interest in him, just one of the hospital patients she'd gone to see out of good nature. In the hut, they'd be alone, and she had promised to come often. The doctor was angry.
"You're not giving yourself a fair chance," he objected.
Robert set a square jaw.
"I shan't go," he said.
To him it was nothing whether he lived or died, but everything that he should have Sally by him. Sally tried in vain to shake his resolution.
"I don't want much," he said. "Mrs. Gillette will do it."
Dr. Hill turned with an exasperated expression to Sally.
"Mrs. Gillette is clean and tidy," he admitted. "She can keep the place in order, though she is heavy-handed and heavy-footed. But she would chatter to the dying and gossip with the angel of death. I can send the nurse from Farley tomorrow, but there is tonight, and she can't stay long. It's out of her way and not actually her district, and Farley is heavy with cases just now." A groan from the inner room reached them. Robert was in agony most heroically borne, but terrible. The attack passed as suddenly as it came, leaving the patient livid and gasping and dangerously weak. Sally, powerless to aid, had watched with an anguished heart. "You see," exclaimed Dr. Hill, "how can he be left to that? He must have opiates, restoratives. He's pretty far gone."
"I'll stay," said Sally instantly. "Of course, I've never done any nursing, but I'm sure I shall be all right if it's nothing to do with blood. I can at least follow your instructions minutely." He patted her on the shoulder.
"My dear Sally, I have every confidence in you. You're a little brick. What about letting Lovelady know?"
"Oh, the Gillette girls always spend their evenings out at the farm," she returned. "I'll send a note by Kate, and she will leave it for me on her return." She spent the night in the hut, and did what she could for Robert Cantyre. He had another attack of pain, but it was not so violent, and the means of relief were at hand. All the night through, even when barely conscious, he clung to Sally's hand as a drowning man clings to a straw. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Sally on the Rocks by Winifred Boggs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23. Parson Sally is to marry Mr Bingley of the bank. When the nurse came up from Farley, Sally went home and got some sleep. As she expected, the nurse was unable to stay for any length of time, and Sally spent another night with the sick man. For the greater part of 3 days, and all of the 3 nights, she fought for his life, and won. At least Dr. Hill insisted it was her doing, but then he happened to be very fond of Sally. The pain and inflammation disappeared as suddenly as it came. It became merely a question of recovering strength and taking a considerable amount of nourishing food. Sally was not a useful person for choice, though capable when forced to be, but she had one domestic accomplishment. In her Paris studio days she had done her own cooking, and done it well, and now she cooked for Robert Cantyre, and stood over him till he had eaten. After the first time he did not resist. It was useless for one thing. For another, everything that Sally did had a way of tasting delicious. Perhaps there was also the fact to be taken into account that his appetite was returning with his strength. Mrs. Gillette came in to scrub and tidy twice a day, but it was Sally upon whom the patient depended. When he was allowed to sit up, she still spent the greater portion of the day with him, and they found themselves with many subjects and interests in common. They learned more of each other also, or Robert learned much about Sally, but Sally soon learned all there was to know about Robert. He worried continually about his uncle and godfather, the old man in Canada who had never written. "We were such pals," he would say over and over again, "and somehow I felt there would be one person in the world whose verdict would be merciful. But I suppose it is the one crime no true Cantyre could ever forgive. Could I have forgiven it in another? God knows." He was thoughtful. "Yes, you would have forgiven anything but cowardice," she answered, "and I feel it's the same with your uncle. The letter must have miscarried."
"Oh, that's possible, but not likely. My sisters send everything on to me."
He did not add that they never wrote themselves, but Sally felt it, and her mouth hardened. She hated those sisters.
"Uncle Robert hoped I would come across his grandson at the front," went on Cantyre. "Cecil was my nephew, of course, but I have not seen him since he was a fine little fellow of 10. He's just 21, and was one of the first to get out with the Canadians. He and I are the last now. I hope he will come out all right. What my uncle would do without him I can't think. They've a huge ranch out in Alberta, and were doing very well, but of course Uncle Robert is old now. To tell you the truth, I've been hoping and praying he'd send for me. I should like the life, and I think I could do well at it."
"Oh, indeed you could. But how lonely."
"Yes," he said slowly, "but a man's life, building, carving something out. There's freedom and space in it, and perhaps redemption and forgetfulness."
"He may write yet."
No, he'd write the moment he got my letter, or not at all. It would only be not at all if he thought I had put myself beyond the pale. Well, I'll stay on with Gillette for a bit, that's only fair, and then I'll take a ticket to Canada and chance my luck. It'll be a new life, like being born anew in a new land."
"New lands have not much attraction for me," owned Sally frankly. "I find Paris and London good enough, and Litte Crampton in between, though it is spoiled by the little Cramptonians. Isn't Lovey a dear, though?" Mr. Lovelady had been up several times, and the two men had taken greatly to each other. They talked a lot of Sally, laughed with her and at her, laughter with a note of tenderness in it. Sally in turn teased both and tyrannised over them unmercifully. She was thoroughly in her element, mothering the outcast. "I'm getting quite fond of White," she informed her guardian as he came to fetch her home one evening. "He's brave and simple and rather fine." Mr. Lovelady nodded. He had found Cantyre this, and more. "He is also a very handsome specimen of manhood," he added slowly, "and well bred. There's been something, of course, and I fancy you know it, but it's nothing vile. He's hasty and proud, a little hot. Is he staying on here?" "He talks of going to Canada soon." "Oh, he'd do well there, I should not wonder. But dear me, all the fine young fellows going and the fine girls staying. That's not the right way of it." He turned, looking hard at Sally. She met his eyes squarely enough, though her colour rose. "Oh, well, Canada is scarcely an Eldorado," she objected. "No, but it's empire-building, my dear, and the lion cubs are proving pretty useful to the old lion in more ways than one. If my girl had lived, I should have been glad and proud to think of her making a home for some fine young fellow out there, helping the desert to blossom like a rose." Sally wriggled. "Oh, Lovey, don't be poetical just before supper. Wait till afterwards." "I should have trusted her with a fellow like Cantyre," went on the Reverend Adam, determined to have his say. "He's a true blue. He would not fail a woman. He'd be unselfish and devoted, and she'd be a very lucky woman." "I dare say, darling, but I expect the lucky woman's nose would be bright red all the winter, and her hands blue." He half smiled. "My dear, a woman goes with her man to the uttermost ends of the world, and gladly, as a man with his woman." "They'd need to be good sailors," was all she said. "Oh, Sally, ease and money and place go far in this little island, too far, God knows, but they're not the things that count in the end. Bound with their shackles, one cannot reach the mountain top." "Oh, mountain tops are draughty," objected Sally. "It is character which counts, the high ideal," he persisted, "the reaching up to the higher. It is character which has built the empire, and character and grit and sacrifice which are going to bring it through during this time of bitter stress. We have the money and the power, we cannot fail for want of them, but we can fail, and only fail, when character and grit and sacrifice do. Sacrifice in great or little things is the reaching up to the higher and to happiness." "Oh, Lovey, it's not like you to preach at me," she cried, vexed. He sighed and then pinched her cheek. "Oh, you don't let me, my dear. You head me off with flippancies which mean nothing. I know my Sally too well to be distressed by them. I suppose you guess what I am aiming at?" "A cow would guess," she retorted crossly. "You're aiming at making me as uncomfortable as possible, instead of exhorting me to be sensible and comfortable as a wise guardian should.
You can't guardian for nuts, you silly old thing."
"The young man with great possessions who turned sorrowfully away was doubtless sensible," said the Reverend Adam, "but I doubt if he was comfortable."
"Well, the young man's wife, if he had one, would be comfortable all right," she retorted, "and very thankful, and that's always something. Oh, parsons have such rum ideas. Oh, here's Mr Bingley. Isn't that a new suit I see before me? How chaste and positively becoming." She smiled pleasantly on the bank manager, who passed them a little stiffly. Mr Bingley knew all about Sally's latest proceeding. The whole of Litte Crampton knew, and discussed it with some gusto. Such a handsome young man, and so mysterious. Quite the gentleman, it was said. Of course Mr Bingley disapproved. How could he do otherwise? He would have disapproved if the patient had been the most unprepossessing of rough labourers. There were institutions and nurses and so on for those sort of people. Was he not taxed to support them, and taxed most heavily? But the patient was not old, or unprepossessing, or rough. A woman, romantic and foolish, might suppose him far otherwise, and there was a mystery attached to him. To the sensible sex, mystery spelt discredit. To women, alas, it meant glamour only too often. He was glad to find the too easy guardian taking Sally home, and evidently giving her a good talking to. He'd bring her to her senses. No guardian would encourage such conduct. He would have business at the vicarage that very evening, if only to see that everything was as it should be. It seemed to him that it was. He found Sally in a mood that charmed and dazzled him, and he went home confident that all was well.
"Don't marry a woman who has a male interest previous to marriage," advised the seer. "She will have a multiple of male interest afterwards, and her husband will not even be one of the crowd."
Oh, wonderful genius, foreseeing even the man of the moors! Mr Bingley was most decidedly not going to marry a woman with another male interest, at least not till she showed her readiness to give up that interest. Sally went up to bed 3 stairs at a time. Yes, Mr Bingley was getting nearer every day, whether he knew it or not. "I must be very, very careful," she warned herself. "He's only just on the verge. The least fright would cause him to retreat once more." She decided to spare the bank manager that fright. Then she forgot Mr Bingley, but she did not forget Mr Bingley's possessions. She wasted his money in riotous living, clothes, furniture, and other oddments. "Oh, I feel like an outcast cat that's got itself adopted at last," she thought. And then, inconsequent Sally, she suddenly remembered that she'd forgotten to tell Mrs Gillette what Robert was to have for supper and breakfast. Could she trust that well-meaning gossip? She tossed from side to side. "Oh, what a silly, potty little thing to keep me awake," she thought indignantly. She was at the hut earlier than ever the next day, and asked quite breathlessly about the patient's breakfast. Mrs Gillette, however, had not failed her, and Robert seemed ever so much better and in good spirits. Sally was surprised when she glanced at her watch. How quickly time flew in the hut! Odd how much they always had to discuss together. She got up with an exclamation. "Who would have thought it was so late?" and held out her wrist. Robert's fingers closed tightly round it as he affected to be examining the time, and suddenly afflicted with short sight. He had indeed turned so that for a moment his lips rested against the little hollow of the rounded wrist. How his fingers throbbed! It was as if she could feel the beat of his heart in hers. "You have lovely hands," he said, very low. "All the time I was ill I thought of them. They seemed to bring me healing." She coloured, and her eyes avoided his, as she said lightly, "Oh, you sick people get strange fancies." Then she withdrew her hand, and promising to come next day, went rather quickly out of the hut. Robert's eyes followed her wistfully, a great longing in them. "There she goes, the only one in all the world for me," he thought, "and never, never to be mine." Just a sick man's fancy, Sally told herself, walking very fast. Don't be a silly fool and get ideas in your head now, for goodness sake. Remember Mr Bingley. What would he think of ideas? She gave a little laugh, but it was startled rather than mirthful. Between two stools. Well, she knew that. She was the last person in the world to come such a cropper. She happened to know what croppers meant, bruises that lasted. She had had enough bruises to last a lifetime, and was seeking rather the panacea to destroy even their memory. And I've almost got it. Almost, she thought feverishly. She became conscious that she was trembling, and rage mastered her. Nerves, nerves, she cried. How perfectly ridiculous. He'll forget all about it when he's up and well again. One can't be too snubby with a sick man. She was conscious that it would hurt her to snub Robert Cantyre almost as much as it would hurt him. There was something about him that appealed to her, appealed most strongly. She had loved Jimmy. She did not notice she was putting it in the past tense, but Robert she admired, respected. He was a man one could lean on. He gave one rest. Jimmy had leaned on her. She had not loved him for greatness or for goodness, though he was good, but just because he was Jimmy. As for admiring and respecting him, well, that was quite a different thing, but it was a thing that brought its own peace with it. How heroically Robert had borne those moments of cruel anguish, how thoughtful and unselfish he had invariably been, how courteous to the rather tiresome Mrs. Gillette, how patient and how strong. Yes, he appealed to her, for strength was rare, just as the great noble simplicity was rare. Then he had the faults which made him human, she nearly said lovable, a touch of pride and haste and temper. During his times of weakness he had seemed so much like a child, a little wilful, but never peevish. He had appealed to her most strongly then. She had felt all mother-woman, a thing she had never felt before. He had brought her new sensations, new interests, and she supposed that was why he was seldom out of her thoughts. His future certainly was a problem, but she had every confidence in his ability to face it. She'd be sorry when he sailed for Canada, very sorry, but perhaps it'd be a good thing. There was Mr Bingley. After Sally had gone, Mrs. Gillette bustled in and thumped about tidying up, her tongue going very fast all the time. She brought his supper, setting it down with a bang on the table by his side. "There, Miss Sally's been here. She arranges flowers that beautiful, don't she, Mr. White? Well, she's a nice young lady and always was, though one for the men, they say, and consequent the ladies have their knives into her something cruel at times. But I never took no heed of it. Handsome wins, I says, and win she has, right enough. I don't grudge her luck. It must have taken some doing, but she done it and earned it. Quite a handsome young gent, too, considering, and worth his millions, they say." "What do you mean?" asked Cantyre, catching his breath. Mrs. Gillette proceeded to thump about. She didn't turn. "What, haven't you heard? Why, it's all over the place. My girl Kate, what works there, says it's as true as death." "What is?" "That Parson Sally is to marry Mr. Bingley of the Bank. A very grand gent, I'm sure, and pleasant enough in the house, Kate says, once you get to know his little ways. Aye, she's rare luck, but I wish her all she can get, I'm sure, and a daughter with them fetching black eyes and yellow hair. Not that hers ever grew that colour, and what he has is muddy like. Why, you ain't never touched your supper. Ain't it cooked right?" She turned around. "Are you going to have one of them attacks again? Are you took queer like, Mr. White? Oh, my husband's brother went off just like that, all of a sudden." Robert Cantyre made no answer. He turned his face to the wall. "Oh, just whimsies," said the good woman indignantly. "You'll catch it when I tell on you. She'll give it you proper, Miss Sally will." End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Sally on the Rocks by Winifred Boggs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24.
how fond you are of the mountain."
"There, Miss Sally," pointed out Mrs. Gillette next day. "I said as I'd tell on him, wasting good stuff, shameful. No supper last night, and scarce tasted his breakfast this morning."
Sally thought the patient looked paler than usual.
"Don't you feel so well?" she asked anxiously.
He avoided her eyes.
"I'm quite well, thank you."
"Then why didn't you eat your meals?"
"Because I get sick of being stuffed like a capon," he said ungraciously. "It's eat all day and half the night. A fellow's got to put his foot down somewhere."
"Oh, never mind your foot," retorted Sally. "It's the food you've got to put down. Now you're going to have a bowl of bread and milk for being so tiresome." If there was one thing he abhorred, it was bread and milk. But his tyrant stood over him till it had all disappeared. "Now own you feel better," she said, laughing and smoothing the bedclothes. But Robert showed more than a hint of temper.
"I feel a jolly sight worse," he growled. "Everything is beastly. And please, I would like to be left alone."
Sally opened her eyes very wide and started with amazement. "Do you mean you want me to leave you alone? To go? Not to come?" She felt sore and angry. Here was gratitude. Here was logic. One day hating her out of his sight, the next unable to bear her within it. Of course it was the sick, irresponsible child who spoke, and it was obvious from the tumbled condition of the clothes that he had had a bad night. But she had never expected him to turn on her like this. Indeed, it gave her almost a shock. Could one never count on a man? He turned his face from her, staring at the whitewashed wall.
"I don't want anybody to make a martyr of themselves out of good nature and charity," he said stiffly. "I have no right to take you away from more congenial company."
He remembered with a sick, jealous heart that Mr. Bingley was occupied from 9 to 4, and that it was between these hours that he saw most of Sally. Very kind of her to kill time with him like that. "Oh, the other company can wait," said Sally, puzzled. She had not been able to spend much of the previous day with him, and patience got a little exacting.
"Very good of it, I'm sure," snorted Robert. "But I'm the last person in the world to deprive another man of his rights."
He looked at her left hand. The engagement finger was ringless. Did that mean that Mr. Bingley had not yet had time to get a ring? He would probably send to town. "Another man?" echoed Sally. "What other man?" He had been about to say, "That Bingley fellow," but said instead, in a sulky voice,
"I mean Mr. Bingley of the bank, of course. I'm sure I congratulate you both and wish you every happiness."
Sally was taken aback. "You don't sound very congratulatory," she managed to say lightly. "But as there happens to be some mistake, that doesn't matter." His eyes grew eager and hopeful.
"Do you mean you're not engaged to the fellow?"
"Certainly not," said Sally, with the more emphasis that she had every hope of being so very shortly. Mr. Bingley was advancing very close to the flame these days. He was already more than a trifle scorched.
"I'm glad," said Robert at last. "I could not have borne that."
Then he remembered, and flushing, added quickly,
"I mean, of course, he's not half good enough for you. Pompous ass."
"A kind ass," Sally felt compelled to say of her future husband.
"Oh, then I am merely being premature?"
"Don't be ridiculous." He lay very still, and then he changed the subject of his own accord.
You have the paper, I see. Any news?"
Sally started, and her face grew very grave. She laid her hand on his for a moment, and then she said, "Bad news for you."
"The boy? Cecil is in the casualty list?"
"Second Lieutenant C.K. Cantyre, Canadian Forces, killed."
invaluable and wanted and so taken, he said rather bitterly, while I lie here a useless log and an outcast. His is the luck. Asphyxiated, oh my God. He was reading with horror of the damnable gases employed. But the road to Calais held, said Sally, and the world is ringing with the undying fame of our grand Canadian force. Oh, my poor uncle, this will about finish him. First the son and then the grandson. They worthily lost in battle, and a disgraced man the sole Cantyre left to carry on the family tradition. Oh, to have fought again! He may burn the letter, but I must write just the same. Might I have those things off the shelf? The letter was written with some difficulty, and Sally promised to post it. She was glad he did not return to the matter of Mr Bingley. She didn't care for lying for its own sake, and he pushed her rather close to falsehood. By the time she was engaged to Mr Bingley and her future happily secured, Robert Cantyre would be up and about, quite well and strong again, and she would have him off her mind. At present he was very much on it. War nerves, that's what's the matter with me, she decided. After all, the war is bound to come into our lives, directly or indirectly. Robert Cantyre, the last Cantyre, and I, the last Lunton, but with what different traditions behind us. He must be noble for the sake of them, but I have nothing to make myself uncomfortable for, thank goodness. The next time she saw Robert, he was much better. Soon he was allowed up, and then out. In an incredibly short time he returned to work of his own accord, and seemed none the worse for it. It was difficult to believe he had been ill. He had changed, though, in other ways, become a little shy of Sally, sometimes even brusque, though his eyes held their welcome. In the evenings he would climb the mountain, and he usually found Sally there. They would sit on the boulders and stare down at the sea. Sometimes they'd talk a great deal. At other times they would sit there in complete silence. At all times the name of Mr Bingley was most carefully avoided between them. He had decided to go out to Canada before long. He didn't say why he still remained in Litte Crampton, or mention why he had come to love the mountain he had once thought so ridiculous, and the sea lying like a distant mirage at their feet. He remembered he was outcast and penniless, and that some things must be forever set beyond his reach. He would reach his heart's desire when he reached the sea. "Oh, I wish I wasn't the last Cantyre," he burst out one evening. "Oh, let's hope you're not the last," she returned. "That would be a misfortune indeed. I like to think of you building up your life afresh in the colonies, making good, and of some splendid woman, such as there are out there, helping you, and of sons to consolidate what you've begun." The picture did not seem to appeal to Robert. He plucked at the short grass, his eyes very intent on his task. "I shall never marry now," he said with finality in his tones. Sally laughed. "Oh, 35 isn't the end of everything," she said. "When you have the home ready, I feel sure fate will see to it that the woman will be ready too. Of course you must marry. That is absolutely the duty of the last, and a big responsibility. You must carry on worthily, so that the Cantyre family goes on. Your mistake will be quickly forgotten, and the country will have reason to be proud of the next generation." "No," he said with determination, "that is absolutely finished." Sally felt a tide of anger and regret sweep over her as she looked down on the magnificent specimen lying at her feet. "Ridiculous! It would be absurd and wrong. I'm the last Lunton, but I should be sorry to think there would be no more of the race, in blood if not in name." She broke off abruptly, her face flooded with scarlet. She could have cut out her tongue for her rash speech. That race! Bingley Luntons! The Luntons had been bad, but the Bingleys would be ridiculous. The Luntons had been wicked, but handsome. The Bingleys would be frightful. No, hers would be no fine progeny to do fine things, useful things, to make her proud. Her sense of humour told her she was being ridiculous, but some other sense made her loathe this unborn generation. Oh, how much one forgets! How serious it all is, after all, she thought, and groaned. Fat, bald, and pasty. She conjured up an awful mental vision. She saw little girls with pigtails so tight that their tiny eyes were always watering, little boys filling their suits so fully that the buttons wore a weary look. They stood in rows, gazing awestruck at the sacred bank. She knew this was absurd, really funny, but somehow she could not laugh. Robert did not look at her, but his figure had stiffened a little. She wondered if his thoughts had travelled the same road as hers, and hoped not. It made her feel ashamed. She jumped suddenly to her feet and shook out her skirts. "Well, I must be going, or Lovey will be cross, or at least as cross as an angel can be. Good night, Mr. Kintyre. Oh, by the by, I shan't be able to come here tomorrow." "Oh, no," he said slowly. "I suppose not. I quite understand." He knew there was a small dinner party to be given in honour of the return of a wounded little Cramptonian from the front, and that Sally and Mr. Bingley were among the guests. "It's very good of you to come at all, Miss Lunton." "Oh, what rot!" said Sally brusquely. "I want to thank you," he went on with some difficulty, "for all you have done for me. I didn't know a girl could do so much for a man. It has been wonderful, more than one can talk of. I shall never forget it, wherever I may be, or whatever happens. I know our paths lie far apart, but indeed, if I may, I say God bless you and make you happy, always." He pressed his lips to her hand. "Oh, don't!" she cried, and ran with all her might homewards. Mr. Lovelady, who was in the garden, watched her flight and reproved her. "Oh, you might break your neck." "Oh, serve me right if I did," was her snappish reply. "Oh, how fond you are of the mountain," he said unsuspiciously. He guessed nothing of the man who climbed up from the other side, and of what the boulders hid. "But what a cross, Sally! Does your head ache?" "It aches like the very devil," she said curtly. Mr. Lovelady did not reprove her. "Well, Sally," he said, smiling, "the Scriptures say nothing of the devil aching, so I can't refute you by text. But won't you go and lie down?" He wondered if she was going to have influenza. Her eyes looked very wild. "Oh, lie down, be bothered," was all he got for that suggestion. She seized his spade and began to dig like a fury. The poor man pointed piteously to the devastating effect upon his bulbs. "Oh, Sally, you're digging them all up." She banged them down again, face downwards, most of them. "Well, I always do the wrong thing, and always shall," she asserted. "It's in my blood. Anyway, I hate the nasty, fat, pasty, bulgy, bulby things. So there. I shan't have any bulbs in my garden, or roses either. I shall just grow sensible things to eat. Oh, dash everything. Oh, there, now I've gone through that rose-tree root. What a nuisance things are, all over the place." Mr. Lovelady wrested the spade from her by main force. "Oh, Sally, what an element of destruction in those slim white hands of yours." End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Sally on the Rocks by Winifred Boggs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25. After all, what could Mother really know? She wasn't a man. Mr Bingley enjoyed the dinner party, but he did not think much of the man from the front, a short, ugly little man devoid of charm or conversation, and considered rather an absurd fuss was being made about him. He did full justice to the excellent dinner and the conversation of Sally, whom he took in. She not only shone, but saw to it that he shone as well. Looking round him, Mr Bingley was quite aware that they were the only two people in the room who counted at all. Miss Maggie was there. She had to be asked to social entertainments, otherwise they would be labelled failures, and any trifling catastrophe would grow into a disaster. Mr Bingley looked at her. That woman, she didn't count in the least. What was she? Just a gossiping old maid of appalling plainness. When she exhibited her own particular skeleton in her one evening gown, she was enough to destroy the appetites of the unaccustomed, but everyone there had got hardened by time. They knew the very number of her bones. The conversation was scarcely brilliant, or in any way interesting. There was, however, no stiffness. All were intimates.
"Oh, such a bridal month, May. Oh, the blossoms all out," murmured a rather sentimental person present. "But it's unlucky to be married in May, you know," someone objected. It was here that Miss Maggie came in, though the conversation was not addressed to her.
"Not as unlucky as not getting married at all," was her contribution.
Her partner was an old bachelor by the name of Joycey. "Or being married any time," he retorted. After dinner, in the smoking room, he told the other men he had seen one skeleton coming out of the cupboard. Miss Maggie was equal to him.
"Oh," she said, "but you old bachelors are always so cynical."
She glanced across at Mr Bingley and caught his eye. "Aren't you, Mr Bingley? Personally, I always think the valuable ones get snapped up early."
She looked around her triumphantly. Her elderly partner disappeared into his collar, and Mr Bingley frowned.
"Do you still go up the mountain every evening?" she asked Sally. "Such a delightful view. I suppose you know it too, Mr Bingley. You really should go and see for yourself some evening, shouldn't he, Sally? You'll be quite surprised, I'm sure."
"I'm sure I shall," said the unconscious bank manager, glancing down at the girl by his side with an expression that gave him away to more than one present. Aha, Miss Sally up to her old tricks. But this would be a good provision. Sally gave a nervous little laugh. She was not enjoying herself. It seemed a long time since she had enjoyed anything. What a lot of money to spend on mere food. How dull the hero was, though none the less a hero. The whole world seemed out of joint. Why must Miss Maggie remind her of the mountain and all that it stood for? It frightened her a little. How complicated life was. Of course, if Mr Bingley took to visiting it, Robert would have to cease to do so. She gave a sharp little sigh. "Yes, the war has spoiled everything, everything," she heard herself saying mechanically as they all rose from the table. Mr Bingley frowned. Were there not other things to talk of in Litte Crampton save the war? He saw Sally home, pressed her hand at parting, and went down the road humming a little tune in a pleasant enough and musical voice. He felt very young. That woman and her old bachelors. Oh, of course, poor Joycey was an elderly bore. Never been any competition for him. He ought to have got married while there was a chance of getting a presentable wife. Now it was too late. Serve the old buffer right. Mr Bingley was not going to be a selfish, uncared-for bachelor. No, no, he was quite ready to do the right and noble thing. How the others would stare at his dinner parties and his brilliant hostess wife. Some day at the board there would sit one fair and correct Bingley daughter, tall and slim, and 3 worthy Bingley sons. That was a good, solid British family, neither extravagant nor parsimonious. Old Joycey was without a stake in the country, a being of no account and no value. Up to a certain age, say 40, it was tempting and pleasant to be a bachelor. But after a certain age, one merely became ridiculous or pitiable. Now the reign of the desirable bachelor should be changed for that of the enviable young husband and father. Now to make the right and wise choice and stick to it. He opened the book.
Don't marry a woman with a big chin, a big nose, or a big mouth. She won't be malleable.
Mr. Bingley was jarred. His dream struggled in his grasp. Mrs. Dalton had a big chin and rather a big nose, but it was Sally who had the big mouth. Oh, finely cut and expressive, oh yes, but still very wide, many times the size of Mr. Bingley's own very neat little affair, which was now buttoned up in consternation. Of course it was obviously better to marry a woman with one disability than a woman with two. Still, he knew very well that he owed it to himself to marry a wife without any disability whatsoever. And would Sally be malleable? Had she not expressed opinions, the wrong sort of opinions, more than once, and stuck to them?
Don't marry a plain woman in the hope of plain virtues. She may be just as selfish and conceited as a pretty woman without her saving grace.
That was all right. Mr. Bingley was not going to marry a plain woman. It was the last thing he would do. He really had no use for plain people. They annoyed him. He knew it was wrong, for they were to be pitied, not blamed, but there it was. They just got on his nerves. That fat fool Bolivar. Mr. Bingley credited himself with enough of the artistic temperament to be interesting, though not, of course, with enough to be in the least disreputable. No, a plain woman could not hope for a Bingley.
Don't ask a woman to marry you more than once. She will be sure to remind you of it at those times when you are filled with amazement, inasmuch as you asked her at all.
There was nothing to object to in that. He absolutely agreed. He preened himself a little. How could that advice apply to him? Mr. Bingley of the bank asking anyone twice? But then came the pull.
Don't marry a woman just because you're wildly in love with her. You'll have to spend your life with her when you are no longer in love.
Mr. Bingley was resentfully conscious of the fact that he was wildly in love. Where was that merely decent attraction as of a rabbit for parsley? He had never expected the thing to happen to him, did not indeed approve of it, but it was there, deep, deep in him, and his very pulses bounded at the sound of Sally's name. Quite an ordinary name, not even refined, but the sweetest sound in the world. Cold, calm reason pointed out the folly, the risk, and he went on being in love just the same. Instead of walking in, keeping his feet and his head, he had tumbled into this delectable place called love, head first anyhow. Now he could not tumble out. He was just stuck for life, he suspected, or at least till he was married. Sometimes it even came to this. He didn't care a damn whether Sally was suitable or not. He wanted her, he meant to marry her. That was all that mattered. He was shocked at his thought, but a little thrilled. There was something magnificent, exultant in such a state of mind. In spite of his artistic temperament within limits, he had little imagination or sense of imagery. He did not see himself as a ship, rudderless, driven before the wind, at the mercy of the storm, the gulls screaming in her wake, shaken in every nerve, plunging on, delirium, destruction, and yet life. He would merely have described his state to himself as being rather in a fuss. He was horrified at being dominated by such a turbulent passion. It hardly seemed proper. A wife was a commodity to be chosen carefully, thought of calmly, and he knew in his heart of hearts that choice had been taken from him. The tempest was behind him, driving him on. It was indeed difficult to please the new Mr. Bingley and the old, and his mother. He gave the late Mrs. Bingley another chance, almost imploring her aloud to be kind to it, to give the thing he sought to do her warm approval. And how did she meet it? Oh, the ingratitude of mothers! "Don't marry a woman who has lived God knows how or where," she commanded, "for only God knows what your living may be." Mr. Bingley flushed darkly. Then suddenly he rebelled. The new love drove out the old, and he flung the book aside. A revolting son! After all, what could mother really know? He asked himself. She wasn't a man. Mr. Bingley had suddenly made the discovery of his life, and a very startling discovery it was. His mother had only been a woman after all. He was shocked at this irreverent thought, but it persisted. He had made up his mind. He would wait no longer. He would propose to Sally, sensibly, neatly, and get the matter settled. He could not endure to wait any longer. She would forgive him the impetuosity of a lover. He had heard that a woman liked being taken by surprise, swept off her feet. With her happy eyes looking shyly into his, he would not care a button what anybody said, Miss Maggie included. Let them say. He would have Sally. This time the dream should prove more satisfactory. He would not wake an instant too soon. He would hold that long, slim form in his arms, kiss the mouth that haunted him in spite of its wideness. He drew a deep breath, and his hands shook. How happy he would be! How happy they would both be! His to have and to hold for always. He would teach her to adore him even more, as he was ready to adore her, unseemly as it might be for a man to adore his wife. She should not be boxed up in Litte Crampton. He would take her about, show her off, and spoil her. She should have wonderful clothes, and a car too. Yes, even a car, though it was awful the way they simply ate up money. She should refurnish too, if she liked, only he would ask her to keep his mother's antimacassars. They preserved the backs of the chairs. If she coaxed him very nicely to put the book on the top shelf, he would put it there. The young wife should have no rival, till that happy sacred day came when a small king should reign in his stead. Mr. Bingley felt his eyes moist, but it was a happy moisture. He leaned back, a little complacent, perhaps even ridiculous, but none the less kindly. A man with possibilities. The very next evening, Wednesday, he would seek Sally on the top of the mountain and ask her to be his wife. Surely such a place as the scene of her great happiness would please her, and it would suit his glorified mood. It would make him pant a little to get to the top, but the coming down would be easy. They would descend hand in hand. If people saw them, well, let them. The happiest, luckiest couple in the world, made for each other by God himself. They would be married the moment the unlucky month for weddings was out. The whole of Litte Crampton would admire gallant groom and radiant bride. Never would there be such a wedding. He would give the school children a treat. They should scatter roses for his bride, white roses. The fame of it would spread far and wide. Bolivar, whom she had turned down, and rightly, would have to give them a handsome present. Serve the fat fool right. Peyton, that pernicious ass, could not do less than his usual silver salver, accompanied with his cynical good wishes. Mr. Peyton, who had been married twice, and would most certainly be married a third time if fate permitted, did not believe in marriage, and had no hesitation in saying so. Bridegrooms always hated him. Mr Bingley decided to make a speech at the reception that would ring in the ears of all for days. Then he and Sally would fare forth on a honeymoon that would be pure bliss. If people guessed them to be honeymooners, well, let them do that too. He did not care. He would have no reason to be ashamed of his choice. His wife would be absolutely suitable, a Mrs Bingley with race and distinction in every line of her. How the hours dragged till Wednesday evening arrived. He ate his dinner as usual, habit being second nature. Besides, he needed fortifying against that steep climb. But it was still light when he got up from it. It would be light on the mountain top for a long time. At least, light enough. He smiled tenderly. Oh, how different to that other time. How lovely she had looked by the fire. How lovely she would look tonight, with a woman's greatest happiness shining in her eyes, when she saw him coming, her knight. He had a vision as of one setting forth, clad in shining armour. He settled a lily of the valley in his buttonhole and looked at the sky. It looked clear, but one never knew. He took his raincoat off the peg, throwing it lightly over his arm. It would not do to sit on a damp boulder. Besides, it might be chilly, even damp, coming back. He did not anticipate exactly hurrying home, though. Of course he would take care they returned in conventional time for newly engaged lovers. Surely newly engaged lovers were allowed a little latitude. He liked to think of himself and Sally seated on the mountain top, looking down at the sea, knowing that they belonged together for always now, that she was absolutely his, had been created for him. He went forward exultantly. He would feel her hair against his lips. Then suddenly he thought of his galoshes and turned back and fetched them. He wrapped them neatly in brown paper and slipped them in the raincoat pocket. It might easily be damp coming home. The mountain had little damp hollows, and then one never knew about these dews. He always wrapped his galoshes in brown paper before putting them in his pocket, first so that they should not mark the silk lining of his coat. All his things were lined with the best silk. And secondly, because there was something a little lacking in refinement about galoshes naked and unashamed. He quite agreed that May, with its blaze of blossoms, had a bridal air. He was conscious of it in all his being. For Sally, orange blossom, a foolish and extravagant habit, some might say, but after all, one only married once. At least that was his intention. He had it in him to be absolutely faithful to the memory of the one woman. If he left her a widow, almost as painful a thought, and she survived her crushing loss and grief, she also would never wish to marry again. For her own protection, and to make sure, and because well-endowed widows were got round by fortune-hunters, he would leave her penniless in case she tried to replace the priceless. Women must be protected from their folly for their own sakes. To think of another man spending his money, marrying his widow, it made Mr Bingley's blood boil. He folded the raincoat more carefully, pushed the galoshes deeper into the pocket. Then, in complete readiness for the great event of his life, the carefully considered proposal ready to his tongue, this modern Don Quixote set forth. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Sally on the Rocks by Winifred Boggs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. I am lower than the beasts that perish. Sally awaited Robert Cantyre on the mountain top. She had an instinct that he would come. There was something in the air that spoke of comings, of events. It had been very hot all day, summer heat, and she had unearthed an old cotton frock and an old knitted coat. She glanced down at it discontentedly. How old-fashioned it was, and how shabby!
How outre the fashions of 1914 were in 1915. Had there ever been such a volte-face? Her conscience refused to let her ask Mr. Lovelady for another penny. She knew he would give her anything she asked for, and go without himself. His rule of life was very simple. When there was not enough for two, one must go without. He had always been that one. He accounted it a privilege. Oh, to be done with shabbiness, she sighed, with the petty little contrivances, the hateful stings. To be able to have this and that at last, to do this and that. To be looked up to, envied instead of half pitied or half despised, to be a success instead of a failure. It was time indeed, if she was ever to win out. How she longed for home and place, to be able to meet Dinah Wilmot Randall on equal terms, to have Jimmy realise she had done well for herself after all. Jimmy! She was startled. How long since she had given him a thought? Was that glorious, undying thing dead, then? Had it not been so glorious and so undying after all? Who and what had killed it? For it lay dead within her, that deadest of all things, a dead love. His happiness with another woman must have killed it, she supposed. It hadn't been able to look on that and live. Or was it his presence that had slain it? Was it of those things that throve in absence, but withered as under a rude touch before the face of reality? It was splendid while it lasted, she thought sadly. But it's gone, and gone forever. Must all splendour die, all great emotion just flicker out? Oh, what a ghastly, ghastly thought! She would not think of it. Rather would she think how much better it is to do without emotion, to be left unstirred, able just to enjoy what money and ease and respectability could do, of how comforting to be on firm ground after hanging dizzily suspended over the abyss, of how late he was, how uncomfortable he had made her feel the other night. How absurd to push a person onto a pedestal and insist on keeping the poor unaccustomed thing there. She was of the earth, earthy, no head among the clouds for her. One merely froze in high altitudes, lost one's breath. Oh, God bless me indeed. She wriggled uncomfortably. That's likely, that is. When he heard and realised that this was what she had been playing for all along, and that she had won, what would he do and think and say? He would say and do nothing, but he would probably think rather a lot. They wouldn't be admiring or respectful thoughts. She wriggled again. Would he still wish her happiness always? Still say, God bless you? Oh, what a silly ass I am, she reminded herself sternly. Stop it! Stop it, do! She lay back on the boulder, her arms crossed beneath her head. He was late. Late, so late ye shall not enter now. What made her think of that? Comes of staying in a clergyman's house, I suppose, one of Lovey's texts. Did he mean never to come again? Had he realised? Oh, better so, far, far better so, only... Well, one couldn't expect everything to be easy. After a while it would be pleasant enough, and he would be far away working out his salvation beneath the northern lights, and winning out like a man. It was easier for men, quite simple for them. For women it was entirely different. They were still tied. How lucky men were, and how little they realised it. The thing is to be sensible. Sensible, she reminded herself, not to think too much or worry, just to enjoy as you go along, getting as much of the smooth as possible. That's it, the smooth, the soft job. She knew what the rough road meant only too well. The feet of 18 could travel that way lightly enough, make a jest of it. Not so the feet of 31. They lagged a little, had grown a trifle heavy in those long 13 years. They needed the easy way. She looked up into the sky, and one by one tiny little pinpoints of light twinkled here and there. It seemed to her that each had its friendly little face, that the heavens understood the turmoil and the stress of those below, and did not utterly condemn, while they counselled calm. It was austerity without hardness, purity without iciness, a vastness, a promise, and a peace. Yet the same sky was looking down on the bloodiest battlefield of history, on a world in the anguish of travail, bringing forth not the living, but the dead, nay, not peace, but a sword. The stars seemed to run together in the shape of one, to shine blood-red, flaring across the sky, to shriek aloud of nations locked in a death struggle, of the inexorable price that must be paid ere the sword was sheathed, paid by thousands and tens of thousands, by nations and individuals, by those that dwelt in palaces and those whose heads lay under a humble cottage roof. The stars broke up, the sword dispersed. The lights ran hither and thither, playing at ships riding upon the waves. Sally watched them entranced, a great fleet with courage always at the helm. She blinked, and the stars were shattered, and there lay a mighty ship in the death throes, sinking, sinking, death on every side of her, death beneath her feet, on her blistering decks the dying and the dead. She saw the living gallant band, their faces to the fore, meeting the end with a heroism and a sacrifice which lies beyond words. All this for what? That one of the great nations shall go down into the very dust and raise her head no more till this generation shall have passed away. That here and there the map shall be painted in other colours, that the fair lands of pasture shall raise crosses instead of crops, that every village, every street of the many nations shall know mourning and loss, and the angel of death be abroad in the land, his wings beating in sunlight and in shadow, that where there has been laughter there shall be weeping, and even the feet of children shall falter in their play. Sally hid her face in sore abasement. At such a time, in such a world, she was thinking of herself, of her own ease and her own comfort. She had put all her energies, all her thoughts into these things, and into the pursuit of Mr. Bingley. "I'm lower than the beasts that perish, infinitely lower," she thought, appalled at having to meet herself face to face, and see what manner of person she was. She dare look no more on the sky. She looked instead at the sea. And lo, out of that mystic sea, visions came surging that would not be denied. A great throng. Here was martyred Belgium. The mailed fist held the cup to her lips. The voice of God's anointed bade her drink to the dregs. And the great little country, her head bloody but unbowed, drank to the resurrection. Nuns, maids, wives trailed past her with veiled, bowed faces. They pointed to Sally. They seemed to say terrible things, wondering, accusing. The little children came next, a great multitude, their eyes haunted. One small maid who had not even been left her eyes to weep with, a babe without the little hands to catch at the sunbeams. These were they whom war had crucified upon the iron cross. The homeless aged, things that couldn't be spoken of, on and on, a procession without a beginning and without an end. And one who stood apart, who had permitted these things, still sowing, still far from his reaping, his last hour and his last cry, "Let the day perish wherein I was born, and the night wherein it was said, there is a man-child conceived." And she was trying to marry Mr. Bingley for his money. Her own men went by, laughing, gallant and gay, an army growing week by week. Sailors passed on ships, their eyes straining into the darkness for the hidden death. All these were fighting and dying, bearing the heat and the burden of the day, while she... A shuddering sob shook her. Then a foot struck sharply against a stone. The mist of these haunting visions cleared, and she knew someone was coming up behind her. She turned to meet Robert Cantyre, her heart beating fast, her face a glory. Instead, she found herself face to face with Mr. Bingley. Mr. Bingley, pompous but passion-flushed, with a flower in his buttonhole, a little short of breath, but with a look of high resolve upon his face. Then at last Sally knew that all she had schemed and hoped for, all the prosperity she ached for, everything, or almost everything, was within her grasp at last. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Sally on the Rocks by Winifred Boggs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. Sally? Sally! Mr. Bingley had his proposal at the tip of his tongue, something a little poetical, but at the same time sensible and suitable. He would start by saying what a delightful evening it was, and then, letting himself go a little, go on to say that all evenings in Sally's company were delightful to him, come wet or fine, and from that come naturally to, "I do not want to rush you, but if I might always have your company as my wife, will you do me the honour to marry me? I think we should be very happy together, and I need not say I would consider your welfare in every way." Surely that was the perfect mean, sober, lover-like, Bingley-ish. What happened, however, might be lover-like. It was certainly neither sober nor Bingley-ish. At sight of Sally, with that strange, almost unearthly glory in her face, all the carefully prepared things fled. He just caught her by the sleeve and stammered like a schoolboy. His dignity was forgotten and dead. An absurd delirium shook him. He was shaken to the very soul of him, where another Mr. Bingley, of whom he suspected nothing, lurked deep down. It was the case of the genie and the bottle all over again. The cork flew out of the cramped little soul, and a giant arose, something far too vast to get back into his habitation. "Sally," he stuttered, "I love you. Sally, I love you. Sally, Sally, I love you, Sally. Will you be my wife? Will you? Will you? Why don't you answer? There was love and welcome in your eyes when I came. You knew, you knew. Sally, Sally." It was not a voice, it was a cry. He tried to draw her to him. He was trembling, glorified, a strange and rather wonderful Mr. Bingley. "I must keep my head," thought Sally. "I must remember to be sensible. Sensible. All it means. The alternative." But the man's passionate outburst frightened her. She hadn't thought to face this, to cheat it. The man had seemed so little, so mean. Yet the thing he offered was neither. It was a big thing, far larger than the man himself, far more powerful. His very humanity startled her. The lay reader, the typical Mr. Grundy, was almost primitive. He was no longer reader and bank manager, but just a man who wanted her, needed her. He ceased to be a pompous absurdity, a figure to mock at. He was a man. This Mr. Bingley made her feel small and mean. He was only asking to give. She had only the mind to take his money and possessions, and give him a half-mocking tolerance. "Oh, don't!" she cried, twisting away. "Oh, please don't! I've taken you by surprise," he stammered. "Rushed you. Oh, but I love you so. Oh, Sally, Sally." His trembling hands closed round her arm. "Oh, you must let me think. It's so surprising, so sudden," she gasped. "Oh, but you love me. I'm sure of it. Oh, you will. You must. I should go mad if you didn't. I'll give you everything, everything. You shall scatter the money, scatter it. Oh, my God, what am I saying? You shall have all your own way. Sally, Sally, darling, don't look like that. I will be your slave.
Yes, I know it's wrong, but I don't care. I don't care. I don't care about anything if only you will marry me." In that moment the giant Mr. Bingley out of the bottle spoke no more than the truth. He did not care. It was possible, of course, that later he would relapse, and relapse badly, and that his last state would be worse than his first, but he was far from that condition now. "Marry me, marry me," he cried. "Oh, you must give me time," she got out. I must think it over. It's such a big thing. All one's life. 2 lives. I can't decide in a moment." She also was trembling, also torn, her soul divided against itself. All the time a little voice was urging, "Sally, you silly ass, be sensible. Remember, remember. Do you want to cut your throat? This is better than you dared to hope. You could rule him absolutely, get all you want. Such a chance, never to come again. Fool, oh fool." "Oh, but I have decided, absolutely decided," he cried. "Thought it all out. You have only just got to say yes. Oh, Sally, my Sally, say it." He pressed up against her. Sally either could not or would not. Her throat went dry, and she put her hand up to it as if she were choking. "I can't. Not tonight," she stuttered. "Not tonight. So much has happened. Things are different. I must think and try. Give me a little time. A day, a week. Yes, I insist. You must give me a week." Mr. Bingley once more saw himself waking the instant too soon. He pressed closer. "No, no," he cried angrily. "It isn't fair. It isn't fair. Don't you understand? I am offering to marry you, to make you my wife, Mrs. Alfred Bingley of the Bank. How can you hesitate? How can you? I will not stand it. Oh, you're teasing me, naughty Sally. You shall pay me for that." His face was almost touching hers. "Now say yes, darling, my little girl, my love, my angel, my all." Mr. Bingley had a still, small voice in his ear also. "You must be mad," it cried, shocked. "Quite mad, man. Is this cool reason? Is this the way for a Bingley to propose? Is this the calm sea of matrimony upon which you seek to embark? Look closer, man. Would you fling yourself into the maelstrom? Is this respectable?" The giant Mr. Bingley did not know or care. He did not even listen. He was conscious only of an unbearable longing to hold Sally in his arms and kiss her again and again. "Oh, little torment, he went on thickly. "Say you love me. Say it at once. Kiss me instead, then. That'll do. Kiss me." Sally shrank back. She couldn't take just then, but she would not leave. "I don't know," she cried wildly. "I can't think. I don't know. You must wait." "Oh, of course you know. Oh, you are wicked and cruel. I never think of anybody but you. Never, never. Even in my dreams you're there. I want you dreadfully, dreadfully. You must say yes. You shall say yes. Do you think you can just play with me? Me?" He seized her wrists. Sally turned white. This strange, insistent Mr. Bingley frightened her, yet she had never gone so near to liking him, almost to respect. The little tin god was made of flesh and blood. Possibilities had materialised. He was even almost passable to look at just then. His love had transfigured his face, gave him dignity and inches, manhood. He had shed the shibboleths. She resisted him, but his grasp tightened. His eyes gleamed suddenly. He flung his arms round her, held her crushed against him, kissed her passionately on the eyes and on the mouth, pressed his cheek against the fine sheen of her hair. "Oh, now, Sally, now you can't say give me time. You must say yes now. You're mine, mine, all mine." Sally tore herself away. "No, I can't. It's impossible now. He turned grey. "Impossible?" he cried shrilly. "What do you mean by impossible?" The little voice grew louder in Sally's ear. "Oh, throw it away, throw it away. There are so many chances going, aren't there?" She pressed her hands to her blazing cheeks. "I mean, impossible to decide now. Time. I must have time. Just 1 week. That is fair. A week. I shall be sensible then. It'll be easy. Only a week. But not tonight. Not tonight." She began to shiver, though the night was warm and her body burning. Something in her voice convinced him that to press the matter home now would be to lose. He turned cold all over. Clammy fingers seemed laid on his heart. To lose Sally? It would be easier to lose life itself. She was his life. The glow of his ardour and the radiance of the vision faded. He had been a god. Now he was a man again, Mr Bingley of the bank. The genie was being tricked back into the bottle. He was shocked at himself. What had happened to him? He had really let himself go a trifle too much, been most undignified. He had lacked refinement, and refinement was a passion with him. He had positively been almost coarse in his love-making. Oh, certainly he had been unseemly. He had shown his feelings with positive indecency. He had not only forgotten to be a Bingley, he had forgotten to be a gentleman. He hung his head, abashed. "I am very sorry," he said humbly. "I quite forgot myself. I hope I did not startle you." He flushed as he remembered those kisses, but he did not regret them. He exulted in them. Well, he was punished for his ungentlemanly conduct. Another week ere he could hold her again. Another week ere he could feel quite sure, own her before the world. A week, nay, a year, an eternity. He could not, would not wait. His passion surged up again. He should go mad. Why was she treating him in this cruel way? He had heard such ways were a woman's stock in trade, that she sought to enhance her value by such methods. But not Sally, not Sally. She was not like that. She was different from all other women. He couldn't bear to think of one speck upon her perfection. Yes, this coldness, this drawing back and hesitation, was maidenly, womanly, and tantalizing. He was sure his mother would have approved of such conduct, and that she had acted just the same in her day. He never guessed that that great and wonderful woman had almost entirely conducted her courtship herself, and that one day she had just said to the man who was still thinking it over, "Well, Alfred, there's been enough nonsense and waste of time. We'll get married." And got married they had. Yes, it was a beautiful attitude, so coy, so chaste. It would mean asking her twice, a thing he had certainly never contemplated. Still, a warm, glowing and blushing Sally clinging close was what he craved. A shy yes, the yellow flame against his cheek. To think he must wait a whole week for this. "Oh, very well," he groaned, "if you really insist. But it's hard. It's awfully hard, darling. I don't know how I'm going to bear it." He looked at her with pathetic little eyes. "I will come again for my answer in a week. Then it will be yes, won't it, Sally?" Oh, how that little voice echoed in her ear, reminded her of this and that, of black depths. "I think it will be yes," she said very low. "I hope so. Only you must go now, at once, please." How easy to accept Mr Bingley at a distance. He took off his hat mournfully and departed. A week to wait, a week to wait. Not thus had he thought to come from off the mountain top. She should make up for that week she had stolen from him. Those lovers' privileges should not be wasted.
No, he would see to that. He would add them to the others. The little witch, his Sally, his very own Sally. He went plunging on, not looking where he was going. Suddenly he plunged into water. Pah! Damp! He put on his raincoat and undid the galoshes. He slipped them on and carefully buried the paper under a stone. Only trippers and such low abominations left paper littering the scenery. It made one think of oranges and ham sandwiches, so disgusting out of their proper place. A week! How many days, hours, minutes were there in a week? Eternity, groaned Mr Bingley. Eternity. He splashed again. Oh, what a good thing I brought my galoshes this time, he added thankfully. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Sally on the Rocks by Winifred Boggs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. Then I also give you a week. Sally stood very still when Mr Bingley had gone. The little voice was screaming now, infuriated. "Oh, you fool, you fool! What have you done?" Sally was frightened now the opportunity had gone. What had she done, indeed? She could only wonder at herself, only hope that the chance would be hers again. "I'm only giving myself a week, just a week's longer freedom," she panted. 7 more days to belong to myself. Of course, next time. Oh, if next time comes, oh, fool! The voice was mocking now. It will come. It would come tomorrow if I liked. Oh, perhaps I shall. Perhaps I shall. It was those things that upset everything. They seemed so real, made me feel so low. But they've gone now, of course. So they argued together, the two Sallys, one clinging to the lower road, the soft road, one reaching to the higher and stony way. This way, that way, seesaw, Margery Daw. She couldn't afford to throw away such a priceless opportunity. She must not. Then her heart gave a great leap. Robert Cantyre was coming across the mist towards her, and had loomed up gigantic by her side. She knew now what she had really been waiting for all the time. She would see him again for the last time. Then they must never meet again. His was the stony road, and hers the smooth. Far, far as the poles asunder. How her eyelids smarted. "I had to come tonight," he said directly. She didn't move or turn or face him. "I knew you would come," she answered. "Why were you so late? Oh, why didn't you come first?" "You wanted me to come? You watched for me?" His face lit up, and he spoke rather breathlessly, moving nearer. "Oh, Sally, you cared whether I came or not?" Then he seemed to pull himself together. "I beg your pardon. I came to show you these." He held out a couple of letters. "Uncle Robert has written. He wrote at once when he heard, but the letter went astray, and I got both together. He's the same Uncle Robert, thank God. He understands and forgives. I want you to read them. They mean so much. Hope, prospects, everything." "It's too dark," she said, moving away. "I really must go back." No, not yet." He barred her way. "You can see to read by this." He took an electric torch out of his pocket. "He wants me to go at once." "To Canada?" "Yes, to the Alberta ranch." She didn't speak for a moment, and then she said a little dully, "It seems the best thing, I think. I'm glad." She told herself fiercely that she had got to be glad. Here was the last obstacle removed from her path. With him away, it would be easy. Of course it would be easy. "Yes, will you read what he says? This is the first one." There was not much in the first letter. "My dear Robert," it began, "I have just got yours. Of course it's a blow, but I didn't need to be told it was no question of cowardice. Just a mistake for which you have paid the price, my poor lad. The greatest bitterness, to which death is nothing, is yours. But you will face it like a man, a Cantyre. Don't do anything rash. Let the rest of your life make up. I wish you'd come out here. There's enough for 3 of us, and that 3 will soon be 2. When I am gone, Cecil will not grudge you your share. It wants 2 to work the place. There's a big job and a fine job to be done. So you never came across my boy? He's safe so far. Please God, he may remain so. We Cantyres are narrowing down a bit, just you and my boy's boy to carry on the name. Well, lad, if you will write or cable that you will come, you'll make an old man very happy. I will then write, sending money and giving particulars, etc. Your affectionate uncle, Robert Cantyre. Oh, he sounds nice, said Sally. He's one of the best, asserted Robert warmly. A splendid old man. This is the other letter. The writing of the second letter lacked the firmness of the first. It seemed older, almost infirm. My dear Robert, it ran, I have just got the wire telling me my boy has followed his father and given his life for his country. I must not grieve, but it is difficult. Robert, you never answered my last letter, and I have been sick with fear sometimes lest you had taken the coward's way out, lest there is the worst grief of all coming to me. I pray God that is not so. Oh, Robert, you were always like a son to me. Come and be a son, in very truth. I'm an old man now. I hadn't realised how old, and my days can't be long, but stand by me till they pass. I cannot work this place alone, and I cannot see it go and be wasted. It's very dear to me, the only home I've ever known, the home I built when my vagabond days were done, the home I brought my bride to, and from which she set forth on her last long journey, and her son and her son's son. Old age is the greatest tragedy sometimes. All the faces are gone save yours. Please God, there is still yours. Oh, Robert, come to me for pity's sake. All I have is yours. You had the right stuff in you. Come soon. Come at once. I enclose all expenses. Reference to a large cheque and instructions followed. Then the letter went on, and as Sally read this, she felt Robert bend nearer, and was conscious of the tensity of his frame and face. Bring a wife if you can, dear son. There's the house waiting, but it's not a home without the woman. It's a hard life, I know, so it will have to be the right woman, one you love with all your heart, one who loves you with all hers. The girl's fingers shook as she held the letter, and Robert's closed over them. The 2 heads were very close as they went on with the letter. It's right away from shops and play, just Mother Earth and nature and work, and a little bit of the old country. You must not bring a girl who puts ease and luxury and the little things first, but a girl big and brave and splendid, who puts the great things first, who is ready to give up luxury and make a paradise for her man. Bring a mate worthy of a Cantyre and the Cantyres to be. I ask no more. If I could see your sons about my knees, and know there was the old breed to carry on, I could die happy indeed. Come soon, but don't come without her if you can possibly help it. Sally gave the letter back, and found herself held by Robert's eyes. I suppose I shan't be able to help it? He asked, very low. It's a big thing to ask, a mighty undertaking, and for an outcast. Isn't it, Sally? She looked round her a little wildly, but made no answer. The line of the sea had faded now in the gathering darkness. I've nothing to offer, he went on, and the life you saved already belongs to you. Just work and love. You know I love you, don't you, Sally? That I've loved you all along. If it's not you, it'll be nobody. Must it be nobody? Must it, Sally? He bent to look into her face, but he didn't touch her.
I don't know, she cried, for again she could say neither yes nor no. Oh, I don't know about anything. Why must you come tonight? Ask me now, when I... A sob escaped her. Oh, how miserable I am. He put his arm gently round her shoulders. Oh, what is it, dear? Oh, Sally, you are in trouble? Unhappy? Am I making it worse for you? Oh, yes. No. Oh, I don't know. She leaned against him, sobbing. Oh, Robert, life is very difficult, very hard. It tears one in two. He stroked her hair. Oh, my poor Sally, you're thinking what it would mean. A grey life, the great loneliness, everything given up and only me. How dare I think for a moment you could care even a little bit, and that would mean so much caring. Oh, I'm such a worm, she said abjectly, such a low, mean, wriggling little worm. I want stepping on, cutting in two with a spade and flinging to that beastly Sapphira, the little cat. I like warmth and ease and softness and shops and people and theatres and pictures and books and clothes and people to show them off to and everything. But I do care, just a tiny little. She buried her head suddenly against his shoulder. Only I do so hate washing up, so greasy, and cold and snow, and I always get chilblains in the winter, and my nose would be so red and horrid nobody would love me any longer, and my fingers blue and swollen, and... Oh, my darling heart, I know. He pressed his lips to her wet cheeks. My own precious Sally, anyway. I don't really expect it. How could I? Only I had to ask you. Bless you. Bless you for caring that tiny bit. You don't care for that Bingley fellow? Oh, say you don't. Oh, no. At least, I suppose not, she stuttered, her face going hot. Oh, but he's rich. He can give you everything, while I can give you nothing save a hard life in a new land. That's it, eh, Sally? She clung to him closer. I never pretended, she murmured. I told you I was a little beast, and I am. No, you're not, he declared emphatically. You're a perfect darling, a very human darling. Sally, it just comes to this. It's a question of caring not a little, but a lot. Of caring enough. It would mean caring so much that simply nothing else would matter. Oh, Robert. Yes, it would mean all that, he agreed. She was silent for a long time, and then she said wearily, I cared like that once, years and years ago, but pain and regret came of it, and humiliation. I'm afraid now. I don't want to care much ever again, though I would not mind being cared for. I only want to be comfortable and respectable, and rich and in the thick of people and things. You do not know what my life has been. You do not know. If you did, you'd understand, not expect. Oh, and the life out in Alberta. Only a great love could make possible. A woman will leave all for her own man, but I am not that to you yet. Perhaps I never could be, though to me you are the one woman in the world, and I would die for you. Do you think I would over-persuade you to your regret? See regret growing and growing? No, not by a word. I would do the washing up for you, he laughed unsteadily, if it happened to be necessary. But it's not quite as bad as that. My uncle has a man and his wife who do the roughest work. It would be hard, darling, but not drudgery or slavery. I couldn't take you to that. It would be lonely and big and magnificent and beautiful. Oh, Sally, to go without you?
never to see you again. But this is hardly playing the game. Just think it over, and I promise you this. If you say go, I will go without a word."
"Oh, yes, but you'll despise me," she cried chokingly. Not love me any longer."
"I'm afraid I shall love you a little longer. Heaven help me."
"I don't know what I shall say," she said, panic-stricken. "I don't know what I want to say or do. I'm just muddled. Oh, why didn't you come first?"
He stepped back from her. "Bingley has proposed to you? You've accepted him?"
"Oh, not accepted him yet. I've a week to think it over."
Robert did not speak for a moment, and then he said very quietly, "Then I also give you a week. Next Wednesday you will decide between us. I will come to you here that night."
Oh, yes. I must decide, of course. Only I think I shall go mad. Oh, go now, please. Go at once."
He went. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Sally on the Rocks by Winifred Boggs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 29. "Just fancy if there was a divorce case in Litte Crampton, Mr Bingley." Mr Bingley, as a lay reader, was perfectly familiar with the love story of Jacob, how he served 7 years for Rachel, and yet again 7 years, and how the 14 years were as nothing to him, owing to the love he had unto her. That Jacob could be content to wait 14 years, while Mr Bingley could not wait 7 days, 7 eternities they seemed to him, simply argued that Jacob could not have had it half so badly as Mr Bingley. In fact, Jacob's passion was overrated. There was also the fact that even an Englishwoman waited for 14 years would be no longer in the first flush of youth and beauty, while the Eastern would be an old hag. No, it was a poor sort of love story compared to his own, a poor sort of love compared to this rending, insurgent thing within him. He counted the very hours till the longed-for Wednesday should arrive. Then, on the wings of love, he would fly swiftly to Sally's presence, in that hour usually devoted to the luncheon exercise. He left his mother's book severely alone, but he read Tennyson's love poems, and felt very much the lover, and rather a romantic figure. Nobody had ever loved like him before. Nobody else had ever married a Sally. How could she keep him waiting for a week, postpone her own happiness as well as his? Cruel, cruel. It was while the fevers of love and anticipation were at their height that he happened to run into Miss Maggie. As a matter of fact, it was of course Miss Maggie who ran into him, though she took care that it should seem otherwise. She never appeared to seek the people she was running down. She just managed that they happened into her. She held out her hand archly.
"You? Oh, just fancy. I thought it was Mr Bolivar. What a coincidence."
Mr Bingley did not see where the coincidence came in. His heart swelled within him. He, Mr Bingley of the Bank, a young lover, gallant knight, worth £3,000 per annum, taken for that short, fat and long-married absurdity, whose income was as ridiculous as his appearance. He looked in the light, piercing eyes, and smiled wryly as he said, "Honoured, I'm sure, Miss Maggie. You don't look short-sighted."
"I'm not. Oh, how quaint men are. Now, the other day I took Mr Bolivar for you, and he said— Oh, but there," she broke off with affected embarrassment. "Mr Bolivar is a bold, bad man, and I can't repeat it. I think myself that it's the male sex that has most vanity, but then I never had anything to be vain of, not even a husband. Just a poor, plain spinster who never looked for one, and wouldn't have found it any good if she had."
"You underrate your charms, my dear lady," said Mr Bingley, in as nasty a tone as he could manage.
and the perspicuity of my sex."
"Oh, what a perfectly lovely word," gushed Miss Maggie. "And does it only apply to your sex? If a woman had this perspicuity thing, I suppose she'd never be found out. How useful, dear Sally."
Mr. Bingley started nervously and gulped. He was glad Miss Maggie noticed nothing. Sometimes her inconsequence was so very, consequent, so tricky. It meant she was leading up to something spiteful. He was not going to help her by making any comment.
"Too many scandals are bad for a woman, don't you think so?" asked the spinster regretfully. "There always comes the one that matters in the end, smashes her up. I think a woman should be like, what's his name, wife, poor fellow, simply unsmirchable."
Some find it easy, I fancy," said the goaded Mr. Bingley. What was she getting at now? The old Moor story? Oh, but surely that had blown over, and it certainly would when the engagement was announced. Sally's too great kindness to the man of the moors? Oh, but that also would be put a stop to. Miss Maggie smiled. She was not in the least offended.
"Oh, yes," she owned readily. "I was one of those kind of women. Very dull, but it can't be helped. It takes all sorts to make a world, and some of us must be respectable. I don't blame Sally in the least. Of course, White of Moor End Farm, gentleman or no gentleman, is a bit of a come-down after Mr. Bolivar and so on, but a handsome come-down, a big, fine, athletic and slim come-down, and that's always something, isn't it, Mr. Bingley? Then, of course, the Luntons always go their maddest after looks. Quite natural, I think. And after all, what's one scandal more or less?"
"There is no scandal," said Mr. Bingley firmly. "Miss Lunton has been quite too kind to White, but he's getting about again now."
"Yes, and so is she."
Mr. Bingley experienced a momentary pang of jealousy. "It would indeed need a depraved mind to suggest that Miss Lunton flirts with labourers," he said stoutly.
"Oh, hardly flirts, that's not quite the word, or labourers either. A handsome gentleman wastrel, you know, so fascinating. Women always begin by redeeming them, and then sometimes have to be redeemed themselves instead. Oh, but of course it's nothing compared to the other. I do wonder what Mrs. Wilmot Randall will do about it. If she had had this perspicuity, she'd never have married Mr. Wilmot Randall, considering. He was poor then, but I suppose she never suspected for a moment he was the sort that got led away. I don't suppose she'll take action now. After all, men with 10,000 a year don't find it so easy to get divorced from their wives."
Mr. Bingley pricked up his ears. A scandal at the Red House? He was glad to get away from the subject of Sally. He hated her name on Miss Maggie's lips. The bitter tongue made it sound like someone not in the least like Sally. "Why, they're a most devoted couple," he exclaimed incredulously. "And nice and good and charming. Quite suited to Litte Crampton in every way. There must be some mistake. You've got hold of the wrong end of the stick this time, my dear lady." He spoke in a tone of condescending reproof, which did not annoy Miss Maggie in the least. She had her rapier and some skill with which to confront his clumsy pinprick.
"Oh, no, I've got all the letters somewhere."
She brought a packet out of her bag, and he noticed without much interest that they all had the Italian stamp.
"As a businessman, I'd like your advice. Quite evidence enough for a divorce, I'm sure. Oh, fancy if there was a divorce case in Litte Crampton, Mr. Bingley."
Mr. Bingley could not fancy any such thing. The Litte Cramptonians did not go in for such infamies, or else they worked matters so discreetly that none ever knew of them, which amounted to the same thing. He laughed. "My dear Miss Maggie, what a mare's nest! Oh, you women, fie, fie!"
"Fie, fie," echoed Miss Maggie, tittering. "What a sensation! And the other person being in the place, though not, of course, a Cramptonian proper, or improper."
Mr Bingley stared.
People with past stay away as a rule, went on Miss Maggie, and leave in a hurry when they're about to be found out. So really, this is quite a new development. What a sensation it will make. Oh, of course, plain spinsters don't have past, poor things. But I've often thought it must be rather interesting. And she is interesting, isn't she, Mr Bingley? So fascinating. Men always run after her. Not that we have any men left here now, thanks to the war, but you know what I mean. She just finds something. That's Sally's way.
Sally's way? Echoed Mr Bingley palely. Sally's way? I do not understand you, Miss Maggie. What has Miss Lunton to do with the Wilmot Randall quarrel?
Oh, it's not a quarrel that I know of, just a scandal. But haven't you heard? Of course I took it for granted you knew all about it. I'm sure it's all over the place by this time. You know how people will gossip. Oh, what a hotbed your club is. Everything starts from there, I sometimes think.
She turned the letters over and over in her hands. The unhappy man plunged on to disaster. I heard nothing at the club, and Miss Lunton could not possibly have anything to do with any scandal. Not possibly.
Then you haven't heard?
Heard what? His voice shook a little. His Sally? His Sally? Who dared to whisper falsehoods about her, the future Mrs Alfred Bingley?
Oh, that Sally, Mr Randall, when he was just Tomkins, of course, had a honeymoon sort of thing in Italy 6 years ago. She seemed overcome with maidenly confusion. Oh, so embarrassing, forcing me to tell you this, a bachelor too.
Mr Bingley reeled. She's married already? The spinster was confused again.
Oh, not married exactly. The unofficial kind of honeymoon, I mean. The other sort of thing. Oh, Mr Bingley, you seem to quite forget that I'm not married and haven't even a married sister. So shocking. Yes, Italy 6 years ago. Quite common in Paris, I believe, among a certain set. And of course the Luntons were always like that. And her own parents too. Oh, to think that you never suspected. How odd. What do you say?
For the moment, Mr Bingley was incapable of saying anything. He was grey and gasping. He felt physically sick. He believed he was going to be extremely ill, and before a lady. Oh, surely the height of ungentlemanliness. And he didn't care. He didn't care about anything. If a breath of this hideous thing were true, even the very bank became of little importance. Nothing mattered. Nothing would ever matter again. He seemed rent by death throes.
Oh, no wonder you've lost your breath, said Miss Maggie. I'm sure I almost lost mine. I do wonder what Mrs Wilmot Randall will do, don't you? Oh, forgive him, I shouldn't wonder. You see, if she doesn't, Sally might get him, and there you are. They would just go off somewhere again, and she would have all that money and such a fascinating young man. I suppose that's what she's been playing for all along.
It's a lie, burst from Mr Bingley hoarsely. A damned lie. I don't believe a word of it.
Oh, hush, Mr Bingley, and before a lady. I've always been so particular. Comes of not being married, I suppose. And you are a lay reader, bank manager. Everybody will have to believe it anyway.
I don't care. There's nothing in it. Nothing. How could there be? Sally, and that? He shuddered, for all the time he kept remembering hateful, horrible little things, all pointing the one way. I shall contradict it. I hope to be in a position to contradict it. I will knock down the first man who so much as whispers it to me.
Oh, but Mr Bingley, suppose he is taller and stronger. Most of them are, aren't they? What would you do then?
Knock him down just the same, blazed the bank manager. I tell you it's a lie. I'd like to choke the vile throat that utters it. He glared at her. Oh, to seize that scraggy throat and rend it. He'd always hated Miss Maggie, but never more so than now. She began to sort out the letters.
Oh, but the hotel managers say it's true. They recognise them and speak of it quite openly. They pretend to think they were really married. One has to do that sort of thing in hotels when couples come from Paris. Mr and Mrs Tomkins.
Tomkins? What Tomkins? Why? He exclaimed, dazed.
Why? Oh, a man of the world to ask a poor spinster a question like that. Oh, Mr Bingley, how embarrassing. You make my duty. Don't you remember? Why, they both owned to it, that tour in Italy. A whole month just by themselves. Paolo and Francesca and that lot, you know. Quite the rage it used to be. And then all those naughty French pictures.
A lie. A lie. Every word of it.
Oh, you'd better see the letters for yourself. My questions and their replies. Everything quite clear. Description, dates. Any court of law would recognise evidence like that. These are the originals. I sent copies to Mrs Wilmot Randall. I felt I hardly knew her well enough to trust her with these. Women are so treacherous, so dishonourable. Oh, but you, of course, are different.
He took the letters with shaking hands and read them feverishly. The thing was only too plain. Not a glimmer of hope was left to him. He knew this devastating thing was true. He flung the letters on the road, ground them into the dust with his heel, as he longed to grind Miss Maggie Hopkins. My God, burst from his anguished lips.
Oh, hush, Mr Bingley. Do remember the lay reading in the bank and me.
The speaker retrieved the evidence. You've done it, he cried. Suspected, spied, and told poor Mrs Randall, trying to spoil 3 lives.
I have saved Mrs Randall from her husband and Sally from deceiving hers. For of course you'll have to get one by hook or crook. Take in some fool, make him a laughing stock. And what thanks do I get for doing my duty? I'm abused.
It may have been no more than a harmless frolic, he said desperately. She was young and reckless, and he even younger.
Yes, just led away, poor boy.
Very unconventional, he went on feverishly. Very rash, but not necessarily.
Well, she happens to be a lantern, said Miss Maggie, as if that quite disposed of the case, as indeed it did. And her bringing up in life generally, and her ideas always rather loose. I don't think her eyes look like harmless frolics. I've seen a little devil there sometimes.
So had Mr Bingley. He remembered it now, and how it had attracted him, lured him on. Oh, she was wicked, vile, his Sally. But he loved her still. How he loved her! It was jealousy that hurt most. He looked at Miss Maggie, and rushing, bitter, wicked thoughts overwhelmed him, topsy-turvy thoughts. Here was this acrid spinster, immaculate, a good woman. There was Sally, kind and human, but bad. So the world labelled such women and such things. Immaculate or the other thing. To be immaculate, to be all. He was shocked to find himself asking if it were possible that the one virtue was exaggerated out of all sense of proportion, and the other taken too light account of. No, and yet there were the facts. Miss Maggie good, and Sally bad. Nothing could ever alter them. Yet many loved Sally, would always love her, and nobody had ever even liked Miss Maggie. His expression grew almost brutal, his thoughts entirely so. That day had come news of the loss of some 1,500 souls on board the Lusitania, and the cry of the drowning children had not sounded sweet in Mr Bingley's ears. This was the immunity of Britain. This was her sea heritage. For a moment the war loomed nearer, seemed almost to touch him, to rouse him. It was becoming serious, one might almost say dangerous. Its poisonous breath hung over the inviolate land. On that ship, good and kindly women had gone down, husbands and fathers, tender children. But Miss Maggie stood here in the road, safe and sound.
The Miss Maggies of the world always were safe and sound, so it seemed to him. No house on fire, no railway accident, no shot or shell found them. They were as immune as he held Britain to be. Should they ever happen to be in a disaster, they would be the sole survivors, and live to a ripe old age, the curse of their generation, and a shame to the mother who had borne them. But they were respectable women. The Sallys were wanton. He clenched his fists. Murder. What was murder? By God, there were times when it was justifiable. Miss Maggie moved back a step or two. She was not afraid, but she was not unnecessarily rash. Her long, thin lips drew back over her sharp canine teeth. She looked like one who could inflict a dangerous bite. It is quite possible, had it come to it, that her bite would prove more dangerous than Mr. Bingley's blow. But it did not come to it. Mr. Bingley remembered himself.
Men like women with the devil in their eyes, went on Miss Maggie. Only not for their own wives, do they?
You woman, said the tortured man impotently. He didn't know what he was saying. He only knew there was no hope, no longer any joy in life. His stable, orderly world was in ruins. The bricks crashing down upon his head left him sick and stunned. He had lost her. Oh, what a blessed escape! If she had accepted him, what a horrible situation now. Why hadn't she accepted him? Surely she should have jumped at the chance. How puzzling it was. Was she playing for Wilmot Randall all the time? Jealousy seared and rent him. Her first lover, if he were her first, that held with a woman. Perhaps she loved him still. She wanted him first. If she failed with him, then she would take Mr. Bingley. Yes, that's what it had come to mean. Oh, horrible, most horrible. The woman he had thought of as an angel. She hoped for a divorce, a young husband with 10,000 a year. Oh, Sally, Sally. Oh, I wish I'd never known, he thought. Then I might still have been happy. If only I'd never known. Oh, God, oh, God.
I suppose Mr. Wilmot Randall must have been infatuated at the time, said Miss Maggie. I always say Sally goes to the men's heads, unless, of course, they're well screwed on.
Randall is a scoundrel. I should like to kill Randall, muttered Mr. Bingley thickly, his eyes bloodshot.
Oh, then we should have a murder case as well as a divorce case, trilled Miss Maggie. Oh, just fancy, what a coincidence. Oh, but Sally wouldn't let you kill him. She's in love with him. I saw she was in love with somebody, and I thought it was White. They met on the mountain most evenings, you know. Stayed there till late.
That too? That too? Mr. Bingley did not dispute it. Oh, she was bad indeed, his Sally.
No, I think it was Mr. Wilmot Randall all the time. And his money. She loves money.
Oh, I wish I'd never come to Litte Crampton, burst out the tortured man.
Oh, lots say that.
She watched him as a cat watches a mouse, cynical amusement in her eyes.
But they come and go, Mr. Bingley, they come and go. I suppose the little boy can run the bank. Oh, how useful, to be sure.
This did not sting as once it might have done, but it stung a little. He turned on her with blazing eyes. You've done this. If you had just let things alone, we could all have been happy. Now it's hell. You're the curse of Litte Crampton. I don't know how God can let you live. All those gone down on the Lusitania, and you here, always safe, just going on and on, spoiling lives.
Oh, dear me, you are quite excited, Mr. Bingley.
You are a beastly woman, he got out. Yes, a beastly woman, upon my soul you are. He stumbled on, leaving Miss Maggie staring after him with open mouth. He was the first person who had ever taken the last word from her. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Sally on the Rocks by Winifred Boggs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 30. I never guessed there were two of me. Mr Bingley went home. An outsider who knew not Alfred might have been excused for supposing him exceedingly drunk, so glazed were his eyes, so uneven his footsteps. His small mouth, so often buttoned up, hung slackly open, and over again a broken sound issued from it. Not Sally, not my Sally, it can't be true. But he knew that it was. He went into his ponderous dining-room and shut the door. He sank down into his big armchair, leaned his head against the antimacassar that protected it from the possible hair-grease, and tried to think. Round and round went his thoughts like a squirrel in a cage. A tap came at the door. If he heard, he did not heed. Another tap, and then Vanna entered. "About dinner, sir," she began. "I've been thinking—" Mr Bingley looked at her with bloodshot eyes. "I don't want any dinner," he said. Vanna's mouth came slowly open, and she rubbed her eyes. "Oh, but, sir—" Mr Bingley gave a husky little bark. Then he told Vanna to go to the devil and take his damned dinner with her. Vanna staggered out of the room and into the kitchen, where she collapsed onto Kate Gillette and had an attack of hysterics, moaning, "Damned me, he did, damned me to H, me and his dinner. Oh, God have mercy on us." Gillette shrieked. "He's gone mad," she exclaimed. "And me just nicely settled and all. Oh, aggravating critters men be, rich or poor." It was all over Litte Crampton next day that Mr Bingley had called Vanna an unspeakable name, cursed her in language more lurid than that of any trooper, and otherwise behaved outrageously and unlike a Bingley. Miss Maggie sent her Gillette sister to demand of Mr Bingley's, "And where did his boot strike, Vanna?" Some people believed this, and others did not. Nobody believed that Mr Bingley had gone without his dinner. Yet he had gone without his dinner. He sat there, trying to think, trying to see some way out of this bitter impasse, trying to make up his mind. She would marry him now if he asked her. There'd be no question of wanting time or thinking it over. She would marry him gladly, gratefully, cling to him sobbing, saying she was sorry, 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 and would never, never so much as look at a man again, just devote herself to her husband, her brave, noble husband. Her wet cheek would be pressed against his. Mr Bingley groaned aloud. How she would adore him for his magnificence! He would be a God raising a Magdalene, redeeming her through his love, taking her to his compassionate heart. He would yet make her worthy of himself and all he had to offer. He seemed to stand on far mountain heights, head and shoulders above mere humanity, a giant among men. If it came into his mind that a wife so raised from the depths to the heights, so nobly redeemed, would walk humbly all her days and adore her Redeemer, and that she would be most malleable, well, even Mr Bingley had a human side, and greatness has its limitations. He would take her for his own, comfort her, see that she truly repented, stand between her and the whole world, and Litte Crampton. He winced. So easy to stand between Sally and the whole world, but when it came to standing up to Litte Crampton, to Miss Maggie, damn her, to Bolivar, the fat fool, and Peyton, that pernicious ass, well, that was rather different. He sickened and faltered, grew weak. If he had been a nobody, how easy life was for nobodies, people without money or reputation or place. How difficult for those with a great career ahead, for personages, people in the public eye. A great career! Did men who married such a Sally, when they had been found out, ever arrive? The thing could not be hidden.
The corpse long buried was none the sweeter to look at when at last it rose from its grave. Neither was it easily buried a second time. Everybody would know and whisper and look knowing. Other women would look askance at Mrs. Alfred Bingley, turn coldly away. She would always be, even when quite old, a woman of scandal, a woman with a past. And he, her husband, the magnificent Redeemer, the great man who had counted the world well lost for love? Oh, no, that was never the judgment of the world. Just an infatuated husband, a man entrapped, a fool. Other men would snigger at him behind his back. His very clerks would talk of it and criticise. People would speak coarsely, say headstrong passion had destroyed him, whisper this and that. Mr. Bingley and headstrong passion? No, no. To look a fool, a passion-ridden fool. He reached out his hands blindly and found his mother's book within his grasp. The habit of years was not to be broken. How often had he looked for guidance? When had he ever failed to find it? If he had heeded her clear warning from the outset, he would have been spared this terrible thing. She'd warned him against Sally from the day he'd seen her, pointed out what it must come to mean, and he had disregarded this genius, with the result that his whole life was shattered. "Oh, mother, mother, forgive me," he murmured abjectly. "Heaven knows I'm punished."
"Don't marry a woman who's had an intrigue. She may make you quite happy and comfortable, but she must make you a fool in at least one person's eyes." There it was, like that much-advertised medicament which always touched the spot. Don't marry a woman with a past. Her past will be her own present and your future. And finally, don't marry a woman because she seems a perfect angel. She is far more likely to be merely a clever devil.
"Oh, if only I'd listened in time," groaned the reader. "Oh, my God, what am I to do? I wish I was dead, or at least almost wish it." The thought of his money being scattered by careless relatives, more than anything else, made life still the one thing to be jealously guarded at any price. He knew what he still wanted to do, to count the world well lost for Sally. He knew what he must not do, let passion decide. Passion. The word had always had a very ugly sound to him, and he had never used it. He preferred to believe it seldom visited really nice people, and never the Bingleys of this world. His beliefs were being sadly battered about, not holding very firm. He once started to read a poem that began, "Naught shall avail thy priestly rites and duties, nor fears of hell, nor hopes of heaven beyond. Before the cross shall rise my fair form's beauties, the lips, the limbs, the eyes of Clarimonde." A footnote from the Poems of Passion by Ella W. Wilcox, with Messrs. Guy and Hancock's kind permission. End of footnote. He had read on no further, partly because he was shocked, and partly because he was incredulous of such things. He was still shocked, but he was no longer incredulous. He thought of it as something akin to demoniac possession. He would and must drive it out. But how? How? To think of Sally at all was to long for her, to crave fiercely, to feel that life without her was scarce worthy of the name of life. "If thy right hand offend thee, cut it off." How easy he had thought that once. Such a little thing to do, to cut off the offending limb called Sally, bone of his bone, flesh of his flesh. The Bingleys that were to be, that sacred trust, with Sally for a mother? No, no, that would be a crime. Sally and no Bingleys? A crime again, wrong piled on wrong. Again he felt her in his arms, the soft mouth against his. He had held her once, kissed her once. There was at least that to remember. If it meant hell, he would not repent of that.
Even if little Crampton heard of it, he would keep the memory, not cast it forth. Oh, Sally of the mountain top, Sally in the first short, wide skirt he had seen, with the arched feet, the slender ankles, Sally the fairy princess asleep by the rosy firelight. All to go for ever, all to be seen no more, thought of no more. Sally the wife of some other man. He could have borne it better had he felt sure that lonely repentance would be hers, but he was not sure. He was only certain that the Sallys did not repent in solitude. She would merely go and deceive somebody else, make him mad about her, marry him, and perhaps bring him happiness in spite of everything. No, no, he would not let her go. By heaven, he would not. Some other man? Never, never. She was his. He had known her his from the first, ordained for him, ordained for the little bank manager. He groaned. It seemed to him that in his big dining room, handsome, stolid and hideous, full of expensive Victorian furniture, very heavy, rather stuffy, and essentially commonplace and respectable, something very strange took place, and that, like another, he wrestled with one not of this earth in mighty conflict. Backwards and forwards, first one gaining, then the other, now failing, and perhaps not sorry to fail, one growing greater and stronger, the other smaller and weaker, dwindling and dwindling. Who was this being who strove with him like the Son of God? Suddenly he saw him plainly, and the sweat burst from him. He was looking on his own face. "I never guessed there were two of me," he gasped, his knees shaking. "Two Mr. Bingleys, and both so strong, so unconquerable. One for right and one for wrong, one for greatness and one for littleness. Which was right, which wrong, which great and which little? "I don't know," burst from him. "I can't think. I don't know." He never really knew. It remained one of life's unanswered questions. The fight raged on, a drawn fight, it seemed to him, for he could come to no decision. 11 o'clock struck, and the time sense penetrated. He went upstairs to his room, feeling as if the clothes had been torn from his back, and as if his face must be bloody and battered. He turned up the gas and hurried to the big mirror, expecting to look on he knew not what, but signs of the mighty conflict at least, perhaps to face a wreck. He looked and gasped. Could such things be? His collar was not even crumpled. His coat set, as his tailor had to see to it that they always set. His face was perhaps pastier than usual, his eyes smaller and puffy, his mouth and chins sagging. But that was all. No bloody nose, no broken crown, not even a tooth missing from the plate. He felt almost personally aggrieved. There should at least have been that missing tooth, so painlessly lost and quickly replaced, that streaming nose. That a man could go through so much and show so little. Though he did not expect to sleep, he got between the sheets. And sleep was indeed long in coming. He tossed and turned, the bedclothes grew hot and tumbled, his pillow burned like fire, and there was something else that burned like fire too, in his eyes and on his cheeks, scorching, unmanly tears. Oh, Sally, Sally, to throw it all away, to spoil everything for both of them. No pair in the world would have been happier, no wife more beloved or more fortunate. And now... He gulped. A revolting and rather ridiculous spectacle, but spared that knowledge. He felt a martyr, a knight weeping on his lady's bier, dignified, magnificent and solemn. He did not know that his rumpled hair looked dreadfully moth-eaten, and his second chin was merely ludicrous when he gulped. He fell asleep at last, his real decision unarrived at, but memory picturing Sally by the firelight, something that could not be forgotten or forgone, as duty told him it must.
When he woke at dawn, there came a picture of Sally by its grisly grimness. Duty seemed easier then. He would write after breakfast and tell her to forget what he had said, that it no longer held good, and why, but he would put it very delicately. It was a shocking thing to have to mention to an unmarried woman at all. Would she deny it? Oh, if she would, and prove that denial. Women always denied things. Unfortunately, they could not always prove them. Could Sally? He knew she could not. It only meant adding lying to the greatest of all sins a woman could commit. As for that scoundrel Wilmot Randall, if he had 20,000 a year instead of 10,000, he would never take his hand again, never greet him in friendship, never ask him to dinner. He would hate him as long as they both should live, and he would get moved from Litte Crampton at once, even if it meant to a smaller bank. When he had finished breakfast, he still found it impossible to write to Sally. He could not hold the pen, and the words would not come. My dear Miss Lunton. They seemed terrible words to him. He did not yet know what he had decided. To be the mockery of the whole world, but to have Sally. To be as admired as ever, but alone. The two Mr. Bingleys had another wrestle in that Victorian dining-room. Again the striking of the clock recalled him to the habits of years. He rose and went into the bank. The boy glanced at him. Bilious, he thought. Been overeating himself, lucky old Buster. The lucky old Buster had given himself his solemn word that he would have his luncheon and then sit down and write to Sally. That was surely the most logical and the calmest time of the whole day. Turbulent passion did not raise its head at such an hour. Neither did the grey of early dawn wither it. Yes, that was the time to make a life's decision and send it to Sally. During an onerous morning, it happened to be the one busy day of the week, Mr. Bingley made no single mistake of any description. Neither did he exhibit the slightest signs of flurry. Miss Maggie cashed a cheque to see. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Sally on the Rocks by Winifred Boggs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 31. Even the soft job has got to be paid for. Sally too had to make her life's decision that week. She thought how she should do it, not knowing it had already been done for her, and that whether she should marry Mr. Bingley or not lay in his hands, not hers. What did she think of during that week? It seemed to her that she had never thought so much in her life, or realised so much. She thought how easy the road of life still could be at a price. She thought of those visions surging up out of the sea, and what others had sacrificed for their country, and the high ideal, of the gallant lives going and gone, of the thousands never to see the June roses blow, of those who had been faithful unto death, and on whose brows sat the crown of immortal life, of those left behind, no less brave, saddened, but proud. Be strong and quit yourselves like men. What a magnificent response there had been to those words. And she thought of Robert Cantyre. She was always thinking of Robert Cantyre, tenderly, happily, restfully. If the other had been passion, a flaming fire, this was love, deeper, nobler, more lasting. One had led to the flame, this reached to the stars. One had been self, she knew that now. This was selfless. One was taking, this was giving. The only thing she did not think of was Mr. Bingley himself. She had no need to wait for the week. When she came down the mountain top that night, she knew. Clear before her lay the road, work and honour and love. Discomfort and sacrifice there must be, but that she would meet with a glad and cheerful heart. Her eyes shone and her breath came faster. Oh, to have found the way at last, to have the chance to make good. The soft job, what a poor, backboneless thing it was when one came to analyse it, this desire of so many men and women.
For it men fought. For it they lied and cheated and were unworthy. They clung to it through honour and dishonour, through cowardice itself. They even married for it. God, let my living be soft. God, let me never be uncomfortable, was perhaps their only prayer, as it was their only ambition. Was it worth it? Surely even the soft job has got to be paid for somehow. Even money has its price, the longest price of all. It is paid for in things that are more than money. This woman who had sold herself under the name of matrimony, this man who had lied and cheated, taken perhaps the unloved woman to his home, what did it profit them in the end? Success and ease most dearly bought would be there. What of other things that would be there, and the things that never would? What of that elusive sprite called happiness? It did not wave its magic wand by that hearth. It had flown. For them it had no longer any significance. They didn't know it by sight, save through another man's eyes. Instead of the fairy, there was only a mocking little imp making faces in the corner, and it was no easier dispelled than happiness coaxed back. Most successful hearths knew this imp well. That was what the soft job meant when men and women gave their all and their best for it, when self and greed were exalted and the true things trodden into the dust. Sally wondered why she had never seen it before, how plain it was now, and how near she had gone to making a shipwreck of her life. She was thankful she had seen it in time. She had often heard that happiness came from within, never from without, that it lay in living for others or another. She had not believed it then, but she believed it now, for she knew that henceforth for her happiness would always lie where Robert was, and that no sacrifice would be too great for his sake. She loved him, far, far beyond herself. She thought rather of making him happy than of being happy. And she had never been so happy in her life. Her heart was light, her feet danced, her eyes shone. She felt almost fey, as if such joy was too great to be borne. She longed for the time when Robert would come to her, and she would hold out her hands and say, "I'm all yours, and I will follow you gladly and proudly to the edge of the world and beyond." She thought of those beautiful words, "Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God." She was thrilled to think that she could echo them. Then the old whimsical Sally crept out. "I will even add, and thy relations my relations, for he has only one in Canada, and he's a dear, and I shall never have to see any of the others. I know I should have hated his horrid sisters." When Mr. Lovelady looked at her, his own face, which had grown very white and weary, seemed to shine too. "Oh, my Sallykin, you have found the real fortune?" She told him all, even Robert's secret, for he had given her leave to do so. Mr. Lovelady was silent for a long time, holding her hands in his, and then he said thankfully, "Thank God for this. I can go happy now." Sally clung to him with a cry. "No, no, you shall not even speak of such things. I couldn't bear it. You must rest more. Why, old John still goes on, and you're not elderly yet." Mr. Lovelady looked down at the dog, who raised faithful, glazing eyes to his. "He's not long to go either," he murmured half to himself. "Who knows? Who knows?" On Wednesday, Sally made up her mind that she must write and tell Mr. Bingley not to call, that it would be useless. She wrote her letter, making her decision quite plain, and feeling a little sorry for Mr. Bingley. After all, he was desperately in love with her in his way. He was ridiculous, of course. He had been ridiculous upon the mountain, though not all ridiculous. Once or twice he had startled her and risen to real manhood. He had shown possibilities, almost greatness. He would make a better husband for Mrs. Dalton for it. They were really very well suited and might find happiness together. Mrs. Dalton would bring her credentials with her in the shape of plump Nina. She would probably give him the priceless little bank manager, as that would be the shortest cut to many things. A car, for instance, and there was no reason why they should not be a very happy little family. Yes, she could feel quite comfortable about Mr. Bingley. It was all for the best in every way. Of course he would be hurt a little, but his pride would suffer most. How astonished he'd be that there could exist any woman who would refuse him. How astonished she would have been herself a few months back to see herself doing so. Miss Maggie Hopkins would be disappointed that her little scheme had come to nothing. Sally had written her letter and was putting it on the hall table ready for posting, when a ring came at the door and a letter fell into the letter-box. She picked it out and saw it was addressed to her in Mr. Bingley's neat writing. The impatient lover, she thought, opening it. Oh, poor man. Perhaps it will hurt rather a lot. I am sorry. As she read, compassion turned to anger and then to fear. So he knew. It had got out. Who else knew? Her hands shook. She would never, never have told Mr. Bingley. Would she have told Robert? Incredible to say, she had simply never thought of it one way or the other, but she never had. She thought of it now, however, saw what she had to do. Oh, she should have told him that evening on the mountain. Why had she never thought of it, seen the one course? She must tell him when he came for her answer that very night. She must not let him ask her and touch her till he knew. Would it make any difference? It would make this difference, that it would be a very bitter moment for both, that what should have been all joy would be soured and spoiled, that he would be furious for the moment, she felt certain, perhaps even hate her, shrink from her, but that his love was strong enough to conquer all, to forgive all, she did not doubt for an instant. She would try and make him understand. Not even to him would she deprecate, seem to regret the passion that had swept her off her feet. It had been glorious, and it had been worth it while it lasted. Not even now did she repent of it for her own sake, though for Robert's she was ready enough to heap the ashes upon her head. He would forgive, yes, but there would be that bad moment first, and the taste of the thing would lie forever between them. His pride of possession would be hurt, his love, his honour. He would suffer, and she would have to see him suffer. He would want to know why she had not told him at once. Ask her if she would have told him at all if her hand had not been forced. Would she? She never knew. It was so clear now when it was too late. She had just forgotten Jimmy when her love for him died, forgotten the old story. It was as if the thing had never been, or as if she had been born anew for Robert. But the stain was there all the time. Must always be there, she supposed. Odd she had never thought of it like that before. She read Mr. Bingley's letter again. "Dear Miss Lunton," it began. "I never thought to call you that again, and now I can never call you anything else. Certainly never Mrs. Alfred Bingley, a title I once thought you might be proud to bear. Oh, Sally, why did you deceive me so? Why were you so cruel? You have spoiled my life. I shall never really be happy again, not even when I'm manager of the biggest bank of all. Miss Maggie Hopkins found out about everything and told me all. What a woman! She showed me the letters. It's useless denying it. How you stayed with Randall in Italy 6 years ago, as Mr. and Mrs. Tompkins. Oh, Miss Lunton, what a terrible, terrible thing to do and be. Why were you not strong in the day of temptation? Then we could still have known happiness together, been worthy of each other. And now everything is over. I asked you to marry me, believing you to be what you are not.
I cannot ask you again now. God help me, God help us both. Awful as this may be for you, believe me, it is almost as awful for me. There are times when it seems more than I can bear, but right is right, and the honour of the hearth must be maintained. I cannot put you in my mother's place, make you the guardian of the next generation of Bingleys. You must see that for yourself. I do not know what is going to become of you, and I dare not think. I am crushed, yes, crushed. I wonder what my life will be now. If lack of money stands in the way of a happier and better life for you, I beg you will think of me as a friend in that particular, and let me at least have the happiness of knowing I was some little help. As for myself, I have asked the directors to move me at once, anywhere. If I lose promotion, I cannot help it. I can't stay in Litte Crampton, where I have seen the possibility of my greatest happiness and known my deepest sorrow, and where people will hear and talk and gossip. As for forgiveness, I forgive you, as I pray God may do. That you have wrecked my life is nothing, but that you should have wrecked your own in such a fashion is dreadful. I pray that henceforth you may lead a worthier life. Goodbye, Miss Lunton. Goodbye. Oh, it was not goodbye I thought we would be saying. I wish... But I must not think of that now. Perhaps this is the divine hand showing me I also have my weaknesses, my faults to amend, that all of us must be chastened. How true that mankind is born to sorrow as the sparks fly upwards. Goodbye, and let me know about the money, any reasonable amount, I mean, of course. Alfred Bingley. A chastened Mr. Bingley, thought Sally, half smiling. Well, so much the better for Mrs. Dalton. But oh, that it was he that refused me, not I that refused him. Nobody, he the least of all, will ever believe I meant to do that now. If only I had got my letter off first. Now I'm just the unworthy cast aside by the good man. People will laugh and pity me. Certainly this was a bitter pill to swallow. Then she forgot even that, for trembling, hoping, and thrilling, she went up the mountain and waited for Robert Cantyre. Light faded into dusk, and dusk into darkness, and still he did not come. The twinkling lights of the village at her feet shone out, and then disappeared one by one. The church clock chimed. Sally's heart sank lower and lower. A fear and a poignant anguish gripped her. Her soul and body seemed rent with agony. This was the punishment. This was the reaping, not of sin, but of being found out. She waited and waited, but she knew it was vain. This time it was the man who had failed. She crept homewards, her head bowed. She was humbled to the dust, beaten at last. She had learned to know the worth of love and sacrifice, and that it should be snatched from her at the 11th hour. He'd heard, and he would not come. He thought her vile. He had not even written like Mr. Bingley. He would never come, and he would never write. He would just go out of her life, and she would never look upon his face again. He would go to Canada, to the new, free life, a man with the power of building up. She would remain in Litte Crampton with her broken-hearted guardian. He would never get over this blow. And a soiled reputation. A woman who had been flung aside by 3 men, passed from one hand to another, a mockery, a byword. She could not weep. It had gone beyond tears. Sally on the rocks with a vengeance, she muttered shakily. Sally on the rocks to the bitter, bitter end. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Sally on the Rocks by Winifred Boggs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 32. In the Midst of Death.
The Reverend Adam Lovelady lay dead among the rose trees he was never to see in flower, on his face that peace which passeth understanding. Old John crouched with his muzzle across his master's breast, moaning fitfully the dog's eternal why in his piteous eyes. Lads and lasses went romping down the lane, the children with shouts of glee, but the others quietly, and two by two. A laden bee fell heavily from flower to flower. The blossom lay on the ground in white sheets, for the time of flower was past, the time of fruit close at hand. In the midst of death we are in life. In the thicket, proud but puzzled parents contemplated a giant offspring in the nest. The mocking note of the cuckoo, sounding from the pear tree close by, held no significance for them. Alone they had brought forth this marvel. Ananias gazed with jaded eyes at the latest blatant matron flinging her golden balls at him. Same old business, same old world. He was getting about sick of it. He made a sudden dart at Sapphira's private worm and secured half of it. Sapphira pecked him so fiercely that he was humbled, while his infatuation and admiration deepened. He found her another worm, a fatter and longer one, and in the finding trod one of the golden balls into the earth. Squash! One nuisance at least removed. Never-ending they were, always going on and on. The spoiled cat sought Elizabeth's sympathy, but Elizabeth, leaving her new summer hat upside down on the rocking chair, was coyly reposing in the arms of the porter whose ears she had once made ring, and being coaxed to name the day. She named it for an even earlier date than he anticipated. The cat mewed piteously and trailed mournfully into the kitchen, seeking here and there, puzzled and distressed. The woman from the cottage close by came to see the Reverend about the christening of her first baby. The Reverend delighted in christening first babies and always made quite a festa of it. Her hand trembled with pride and triumph as she rang the bell. It was this ring that reluctantly rent Elizabeth from her porter and led to certain discoveries. Sally returned that night to a house of mourning. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of Sally on the Rocks by Winifred Boggs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 33. I did some hustle for a husband. The funeral was over. Adam Lovelady lay at rest. Old John was buried under the pear tree. To Sally it was as if everything were over for ever. She lay with face downwards on the mountain top, wishing that she had never been born, or that she could die. She had spoken of being broken. She knew what it meant at last. It had been easy to preach to another, wealth lost, something lost, honour lost, much lost, courage lost, all lost. Now she had herself lost wealth and honour and courage, and the physician could not heal himself. Home was gone, reputation was gone, gone also the only man who loved her and belonged to her, mercifully before he had learned the truth. Gone too the man she loved. What was left? Perhaps a broken heart, but that was scarcely an asset. The country was full of broken hearts and broken lives. They were a drug in the market. When the ancient cheap rubbish the vicarage contained was sold, and the few pounds her guardian had left were handed over to her, she might be worth some £50. Existence for a month or two, and then what? She had not the faintest idea. She did know that her wage-earning capacity was nil. She could not stay in Litte Crampton when the new people came to the vicarage. The Bolivers had asked her to stay with them, but that was impossible. Everybody knew that Mr. Bolivar had proposed to Sally and still had more than a weak spot for her, while his wife was jealous and had been forced to the invitation by her husband. True, Miss Maggie Hopkins had asked her, but Sally had done with the woman who had ruined her out of sheer malicious curiosity. It was a question not only of what to do, but where to go. Britain was very much the tight little island at present, difficult to enter and difficult to leave. It was not easy to get away into some far country while war still had her strangling grip on the throats of the countries. Italy's flag flew with the Allies. Even the neutral nations were finding that none could sit down and say, "Let there be peace," and there was peace, but that this priceless possession had to be paid and bought for. The whole world was in a ferment. It had no room or use for sallies. Yet go somewhere and do something she must. London again. Was it to be just drifting down and down? Never that now. The loss of home, reputation, and future was terrible enough, yet it seemed but a slight thing in comparison with the loss of the man she loved. That dagger was in her heart forever. It was a maimed life she would have to drag about with her. Sally on the rocks, deserted Sally, worthless, repudiated Sally. Her life and work in Paris were utterly swept away. The enemy still had their faces towards Calais, that city of their passionate desire. Not yet had men and munitions seen to it that there should go forth that irrevocable decree, "Thus far shalt thou come, and no further, and here shall thy proud waves be stayed." The war that had raged with ever-increasing violence for 10 months might rage for another 10 or more. 10 months. Yea, it seemed like 10 years. Into household after household entered war's grim figure, saying to this one and to that one, "Follow me to sacrifice, to tragedy, to the last endurance." And follow they did, not because they would, but because they must. Sacrifice, endurance, tragedy. Well, endurance and tragedy were hers, but the willing, happy sacrifice denied her. She pressed her face deeper into the grass, wishing she could lie forever beneath it. She knew nothing of a man scrambling up from the other side. It was not till Robert Cantire's voice struck on her ears that she recognised he had come at last. That he should come too late, and in such an hour as this. Why had he come? To mock her, perhaps, to throw her aside in actual words. Oh, surely he might have spared her that. Her punishment was already greater than she could bear, her head in the dust. She did not raise it, but lay there, a figure of utter abasement and despair. Robert Cantyre knelt by her side and felt for her icy little fingers. "Oh, Sally, Sally, my dear," he began with difficulty. She shrank from his touch. "Oh, you might have spared me this. Please go away." "Sally," he began again. She sat up, unbeautiful now, sallow and haggard. "Everything is finished, but I can't discuss it. I was to give you my answer. Instead, you gave me mine. It comes to the same thing, I suppose, but I don't want to talk about it. Oh, please go." "Oh, forgive me. What must you have thought?" "There was only one thing to think. You heard. Naturally, you did not come."
"Yes, I heard. Oh, it drove me mad for the moment. I did not believe it. I went straight to Wilmot Randall. He denied it, but I saw that it was true. Then I came here, but you had gone. I heard of Mr. Lovelady's death, and I could not seek you till to-day. Oh, Sally, you might have told me. You might have told me."
"You will not believe me, but I forgot all about it. I just forgot Jimmy." She covered her face with her hands. He made a little dive forward and caught her close in his arms.
"Oh, my poor Sally, my poor little Sally, what you've suffered. And that Bingley brute threw you over, they say."
She tried to thrust him from her. "I wrote and refused him, but his letter reached me first." His arms tightened.
"You refused him?"
"Yes, of course."
"Of course? Why, of course, Sally? Sally, answer me."
He pulled her hands from her face. "It doesn't matter," she returned with quivering lips. "You don't want me now.
You never came. Nobody wants me now.
How could they?
Yet I wasn't bad. I thought I loved him. I hadn't learned what love meant then. And now... Oh, now I suppose it's too late." She buried her face against him and began to sob. "You hate and despise me now."
"Oh, it looks like it, doesn't it?" he answered, smoothing her hair. "I loved you from the first moment I saw you. I couldn't live without you, and I won't either."
"Oh, but... oh..."
His face paled a little and his mouth set. "It hurts, of course, badly, but it is forgotten. You are my Sally, my all. You will marry me at once, and let me stand between you and everything. I will book our passages, and we will find a splendid happiness together, darling. I need you desperately. Can't you need me a little, too?"
"Oh, Robert, I'm perfectly silly about you," she said brokenly. "I couldn't do without you now."
He drew her face against his, whispered foolish broken words. They clung desperately, yet happily together, two who alone had known disaster and anguish, but who together were to know a great joy, peace and redemption. Then soberly they came down the mountain, not talking at all, but hand in hand. The news flew from house to house. Mr. Bingley experienced a bitter pang. So this was Sally's repentance. This was how she mourned the loss of the noble knight and the high ideals. The dead love was scarce cold in its grave ere she sought another. How like a woman! He opened the book. He would think no more of Sally, consider only the future now. Did Mrs. Dalton represent the future?
"Don't marry a widow. She naturally prefers being a mother to her own children than to yours."
Mr. Bingley made a peevish sound. Really, mother is a little too drastic, he thought, exasperated. Now she was disposing of the only alternative left. He turned over leaf after leaf. Always the woman he must not marry, never the woman he should. A sudden suspicion gathered and grew. His mother had been a jealous woman. She would never have tolerated a daughter-in-law during her lifetime. Was it possible that she could not tolerate the thought of one even after she was dead? Was it all a cruel, selfish plot to ruin his happiness? Another God gone, another world in ruins. August to May had turned to December to May, and a fire was burning in the grate. Mr. Bingley rose portentously. Deliberately he put the book on the glowing coals. Deliberately he held it in the heart of the fire with the poker till it was consumed to ashes, expensive binding and all. Then he flung back his shoulders and drew a deep breath. For suddenly he realised that he was a free man, that his tyranny was overpast. He was at last captain of his soul, a man. A few days later, as he was walking with Mrs. Dalton, angrily discussing the iniquity of raising the age limit to 40, his heart gave a sudden jump. Alas, that it should still jump at sight of unregenerate Sally. He must put a stop to this at once. It was wrong, improper. There must be a bulwark between him and danger, a substantial bulwark. Once married, any hankering after another woman ceased like magic. That was Bingley's belief and logic, the meaning of morality. He turned to Mrs. Dalton. "Will you marry me?" he demanded gloomily, "and make me the happiest of men?" Mrs. Dalton saw Sally approaching, and understood. She murmured a radiant "yes." Mr. Bingley took her hand and drew it possessively through his arm. He had his bulwark. Already he felt as one close to harbour, outside the storm. It was thus they met Sally, who also understood and was glad. She bowed. Mrs. Dalton returned it. Mr. Bingley raised his hat with a funereal air. The episode was over. On his return home he cancelled his June week in London.
That the enemy would succeed in either gas-bombing it from above or blowing it up from underground or tube, he knew to be both ridiculous and impossible, but he might as well go elsewhere this year. He hoped Miss Maggie would go as usual. The two women met a few days later and congratulated each other. "I have what I want," said Mrs. Dalton frankly, "but you have the man. I think we shall both be happy, but yours will be the finer happiness." "I am very fortunate," returned Sally. "And you? Is it to be putting your foot down and keeping it down, or womanly wiles?" They both laughed. "Womanly wiles," said Mrs. Dalton emphatically, "the shortest cut." She was put to the test a few days later, for Mr. Bingley discovered that her income was a myth, and that she also had deceived him. He was shocked and a little dispirited. Did they all do it? "It was very wrong indeed," he said, pursing up his mouth. But what a little wrong compared to Sally's. Then he remembered not to think of Sally now. Mrs. Dalton cried. She cried rather prettily. "What was I to do? You had become everything to me, someone to look up to. A widow with only a daughter." If Mr. Bingley was pompous, he was also kind. He put his arm round her waist and patted her pretty brown hair, and remembered not to think of yellow hair. "Well, but you must never deceive me again. Money isn't so much, after all." He spoke a little heavily. "I used to think it was, and of course one's glad to have it. But it's a little disappointing, I think, and there are other things. It doesn't bring happiness." He broke off with a sigh. They were married almost at once, not in the least in the fashion Mr. Bingley had once anticipated when he should be made into a Benedict. Miss Maggie was at the wedding, very much in her element.
"He's given Nina a pony," she said. "But Mrs. Dalton, Mrs. Alfred Bingley, I mean, hasn't got her car yet."
Sally and her husband stood together on the steamer, their happy faces turned towards the new land. A great vivid moon made a silvery track across the waters, turning the bride's flame of yellow to fairer gold. She leaned up against her husband and pointed to it. "Robert, there was a time when I almost prayed for a moon, and it did not come. And now it's come without any asking, full measure and running over. It's just like a path to fairyland." He looked into her vivid black eyes. "Well, I've got my fairy princess at any rate," he murmured contentedly, his arm holding her fast. She began to laugh, a long, low, delicious laugh that floated out over the sea. "To think of it, I did some hustle for a husband and caught the wrong one." Robert laughed too. "Oh, of course, I know you will always regret Bingley, and would have had him if you could," he teased. "Yes, it's been a bit of a fiasco. Oh, look, how beautiful the sea is, how wide, how free." The ship seemed to give herself a little shake, and then she had plunged into the sylvan way, on to the new life and the new land, to hope and happiness and achievement. End of chapter 33. End of Sally on the Rocks by Winifred Boggs.